Hello, my dear sleepy family. Welcome to Kavrin. This isn't just a channel, this is your small, quiet sleep corner, where forgotten stories of history come alive in the gentlest way possible. Tonight's whispered tale takes us deep into the shadow of Henry VII and the entire Tudor dynasty, where we'll uncover the haunting life of Jasper Tudor, the uncle, the guardian, the kingmaker who walked beside greatness for more than 60 years. Jasper was a man born of scandal, raised in secrecy, who would spend decades in exile protecting a boy who seemed to have no chance of ever wearing a crown. And yet, through unshakable loyalty, through quiet courage, through sheer stubborn determination, Jasper Tudor made kings. This is his complete story from beginning to end, told gently and slowly, perfect for drifting into dreams. Now, before we begin, I'd love your help growing our little shadow community. A simple like makes a huge difference. It helps other lovers of forgotten history find us. And drop a comment telling me this. What do you think Jasper felt the moment he watched his nephew Henry Tudor finally crowned king? After all those years of exile and danger, I read every single one, and your thoughts genuinely brighten my day. Subscribing means you'll never miss another whispered story, and it would mean the world to me. Now, let's settle in. Pull your blankets close. Let your breath slow, and let the world around you gently fade away. Let's begin. In the year 1431, in the quiet English countryside of Hertfordshire, at a manor house belonging to the Bishop of Ely, a second son was born into circumstances that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The child's name was Jasper, and his very existence was a secret that would shape the future of England. His mother lay in the birthing chamber, attended by midwives who whispered among themselves. Katherine of Valois, the widow of the great warrior king, Henry V. The mother of the current King of England, Henry VI, was giving birth to a child whose father was not of royal blood, not of noble lineage, but a Welshman who had once been a servant in her household, a man named Owen Tudor. The candles flickered in that November chamber as the baby's cries filled the air. Outside, the English countryside lay quiet under autumn skies. Inside, a life began that would be lived almost entirely in the shadows of those more powerful, more famous, more remembered by history. And yet, without this child, without Jasper Tudor, there would be no Tudor dynasty, no Henry VIII, no Elizabeth I. The entire course of English history would have flowed differently. But in that moment, as the midwives cleaned the newborn and placed him in his mother's arms, none of this could have been known. Katherine looked down at her second son. Her first with Owen had been Edmund, born the year before, and she must have wondered what future awaited these children, born of a love that society would never fully accept, born of a marriage that had been kept secret, because the law forbade a dowager queen from remarrying without royal permission. The shadows of scandal already gathered around the infant Jasper. His parents' marriage was questionable at best, illegal at worst. His father was Welsh in a time when the English looked down upon the Welsh as conquered people. His mother was French, daughter of King Charles VI of France, widow of England's greatest warrior king. Jasper was born into a world that would never quite know what to make of him. Let us pause here, by candlelight, and understand the world into which Jasper Tudor was born, a world of war, of madness, of shifting loyalties. England, in 1431, was a nation still trying to maintain its grip on France. The 100 Years' War raged on, though the glory days were fading. King Henry V, who had won the magnificent victory at Agincourt, who had conquered much of northern France, who had married the French king's daughter Catherine as part of a peace treaty, that king had been dead for 9 years now. He had died in 1422, leaving behind a baby son, Henry VI, who inherited the thrones of both England and France before he could even walk. Catherine of Valois had been only 21 when her husband died. For a few years, she had lived at court, seeing her son, the king, only occasionally, as was the custom. The boy king was raised by regents, by nobles who fought amongst themselves for power and influence. Catherine was a beautiful widow, young, lonely, removed from real power despite being the mother of the king. The council that governed in young Henry VI's name had forbidden her to remarry. They feared that if she married a powerful nobleman, that man might use her connection to the king to seize power. And so Katherine of Valois, who had been a queen, who had worn a crown, who had been the wife of England's greatest warrior, found herself pushed to the margins, living in various manors and castles, waiting for she knew not what. And then she met Owen Tudor. The exact details of how they met, how they fell in love, how they married, these are lost to the mists of time. Some sources say Owen Tudor was a squire in the king's household. Others say he was keeper of the queen's wardrobe. Perhaps both are true. What we know is this: Owen Tudor was from Wales, from the island of Anglesey, from a family that claimed descent from ancient Welsh princes. He was handsome, some say. He could speak Welsh and French and English. He was charming. He made Catherine laugh when she had little reason for laughter. And somehow, in secret, perhaps in the early 1430s, or perhaps even earlier, Katherine of Valois and Owen Tudor were married. It was done quietly, in a small ceremony, witnessed by only a few trusted servants. No royal permission was asked or given. No grand announcement was made. The Dowager Queen and the Welsh squire simply married and loved, and began having children. Edmund was born around 1430. Jasper arrived in November of 1431. There may have been other children. Some sources mention a daughter who became a nun, and perhaps another son named Owen or Edward who was raised by monks. But Edmund and Jasper were the ones who would matter to history. For the first few years of Jasper's life, his existence was kept quiet. He and Edmund lived with their mother, moving between her various residences. They were cared for by servants who kept the secret. Owen Tudor came and went, trying to maintain the pretense that he was merely a member of the household, not the husband of the former queen, not the father of her children. Jasper was about 5 years old when his world collapsed. In January of 1437, Katherine of Valois fell gravely ill. She had given birth to another child, some say a daughter, and something had gone terribly wrong. Perhaps it was complications from childbirth, or perhaps a cancer that had been growing inside her for months or years. Whatever the illness was, it was mortal. Catherine knew she was dying. She retired to Bermondsey Abbey in London, seeking the care of the nuns there. On the 3rd of January 1437, as the new year had barely begun, Katherine of Valois died. She was only 35 years old. She had been Queen of England, mother to a King of England and France, and she died in the quiet shadows of a religious house. Her secret marriage still a secret, her younger son still barely known to the world. Jasper was 5 years old when his mother died. Can you imagine being that small child, losing the mother who had held you, loved you, kept you safe in her shadow? The nuns at Bermondsey Abbey must have tried to comfort the boys, but what comfort could there be? And immediately, the secret came out. Owen Tudor was arrested. The Regency Council, which had forbidden Catherine to remarry, which had kept such close watch over her, they had somehow missed or ignored her secret marriage. Or perhaps they had known and looked the other way as long as it stayed quiet. But now Catherine was dead, and there were these children, these half-brothers to the king. Owen Tudor was thrown into Newgate Prison in London. The boys, little Jasper and his older brother Edmund, were taken away and placed in the care of Catherine de la Pole, the abbess of Barking Abbey in Essex. This abbess was the sister of William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, one of the most powerful men in England and a favourite of the young King Henry VI. And so Jasper Tudor, at 5 years old, found himself living in a convent, raised by nuns and priests, his father imprisoned, his mother dead and buried. He and Edmund were given food, clothing, lodging. They were treated well, according to the records, with servants to wait upon them, but they were not acknowledged. They were not claimed. They lived in a strange limbo, too important to ignore, too scandalous to embrace. For 5 years, from 1437 to 1442, Jasper and Edmund Tudor lived at Barking Abbey. Imagine those years, the quiet cloisters, the morning prayers, the afternoon lessons, the boys learning to read and write in Latin, learning the Psalms, learning the history of kings and kingdoms. Did they play in the Abbey gardens? Did they wonder about their father, locked away in a distant prison? Did they remember their mother's face? In the outside world, beyond the Abbey walls, England struggled. The war in France was going badly. The brilliant conquests of Henry V were being lost, piece by piece. The young King Henry VI, now entering his teenage years, was proving to be gentle, pious, bookish, not at all the warrior his father had been. There were whispers that he was too kind, too merciful, too influenced by his advisors. Some even whispered that his mind was not quite right. But in 1442, something changed. King Henry VI, now 20 years old, learned the full truth about his mother's secret marriage. Perhaps he had always known there was something, some rumor, some story that was kept from him. Perhaps his mother had told him on her deathbed, though he had been only 15 when she died. Or perhaps one of his advisors finally revealed the truth. Whatever the cause, in 1442, Henry VI decided to acknowledge his half-brothers. The two boys, Edmund and Jasper Tudor, were brought from Barking Abbey to court. Can you picture it? The royal palace at Westminster or Windsor, all stone and tapestry and firelight. And into this world of power and politics came two young boys, 11 and 10 years old, who had spent the last 5 years being raised by nuns. They must have been terrified. They must have been awed. King Henry VI looked upon his half-brothers, and he smiled. He was a kind young man, gentle-hearted, deeply religious. He saw in Edmund and Jasper not a scandal to be hidden, but family to be loved. He ordered that they be given the best education. The finest tutors were brought to teach them, not just reading and writing and Latin, but also the arts of war, for they were, after all, half-brothers to the king, and they would need to know how to ride, how to fight, how to lead men in battle. And so Jasper's real education began. While other noble boys of his age were being raised in the great castles of England, learning the code of chivalry from experienced knights, Jasper and Edmund had their own special tutors at the royal court. They learned military tactics. They practiced with sword and lance. They were taught to sit a horse in full armor, to joust in tournaments, to command soldiers. But they also learned something else, something that would shape the rest of Jasper's life. They learned loyalty to their half-brother, the king. Henry VI was unfailingly kind to them. He gave them money for clothes, for horses, for weapons. He included them in court ceremonies. He made them feel that they belonged. And in return, Edmund and Jasper Tudor swore their unwavering loyalty to King Henry VI. Not the kind of loyalty that shifts with the political winds. Not the kind that calculates advantage and chooses sides based on who seems likely to win. But absolute, unbreakable loyalty. Come what may, they would serve their half-brother the king. They would fight for him. They would, if necessary, die for him. This loyalty, this bond forged in those early years at court, this would define Jasper Tudor's entire life. Through decades of war, through exile, through defeat after defeat, Jasper would never waver, never betray, never abandon the Lancastrian cause that his half-brother represented. The years passed quietly. Edmund and Jasper grew from boys into young men. They practiced in the tilt-yard. They attended court functions. They learned the ways of nobility. In 1449, when Jasper was 18 years old, he was knighted, a formal recognition of his place in the world. He was now Sir Jasper Tudor, half-brother to the king, but the true transformation came in November of 1452. On the 23rd of that month, in a ceremony at the royal court, King Henry VI created his two half-brothers earls. Edmund became Earl of Richmond. Jasper became Earl of Pembroke, the seventh creation of that ancient Welsh title. Along with the title came lands, castles, and power. Pembroke Castle in Wales became Jasper's principal seat, a great fortress on the coast, with thick stone walls and towers that looked out over the waters where Wales met the sea. Jasper Tudor, at 21 years old, was now one of the great nobles of England and Wales. The boy who had been born in scandal, who had lost his mother at 5, who had been raised in a convent and then at court. He was now the Earl of Pembroke, a force to be reckoned with in the turbulent politics of 1450s England. But with power came danger, and with titles came obligations, and with loyalty came consequences that would shape the rest of Jasper's life. England, in these years, was sliding towards civil war. The England that Jasper Tudor stepped into as Earl of Pembroke in 1452 was a realm on the edge of disaster. Let us pause by the candlelight and understand the forces that were gathering, the storm that was coming, the war that would define an entire generation and shape Jasper's destiny. King Henry VI, Jasper's half-brother, was a gentle soul in a violent age. He was deeply religious, more suited to be a monk than a monarch. He founded colleges, he gave generously to charity, he prayed for hours each day. But he was also weak. Not weak in character, perhaps, but weak as a ruler. He let his advisors dominate him. He could not control the nobles who served him. And worst of all, he suffered from bouts of mental illness episodes, where he would slip into a kind of waking sleep, unable to speak, unable to recognize anyone, unable to rule. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, was the opposite: fierce, ambitious, determined to protect her husband's throne and her son's inheritance. But her very strength made enemies among the English nobles, who resented being commanded by a French woman. And then there was Richard, Duke of York. He was descended from King Edward III, just as King Henry VI was. In fact, many believed York had a better claim to the throne than Henry. York was capable, experienced in war, popular with many nobles. He believed he should be the power behind the throne, if not the king himself. The struggle between King Henry's supporters, who wore a red rose as their symbol and were called Lancastrians, and the Duke of York's supporters, who wore a white rose and were called Yorkists, would tear England apart for 30 years. This was the Wars of the Roses. Though that name would not be used until much later, Jasper Tudor and his brother Edmund threw themselves wholeheartedly onto the Lancastrian side. How could they not? Henry VI was their half-brother, their benefactor, the man who had raised them from obscurity to nobility. Their loyalty was absolute. In 1453, Jasper was 22 years old, newly made Earl of Pembroke, learning to navigate the dangerous waters of court politics. And then, in the summer of that year, King Henry VI suffered a complete mental breakdown. He fell into a catatonic state, unable to speak, unable to recognize anyone, unable to govern. He would remain in this state for over a year. With the king incapacitated, someone had to rule England. Richard of York was appointed protector, essentially regent. For a time, it seemed that York might be content with this role. But then, in the winter of 1454 to 1455, King Henry VI suddenly recovered his wits. He woke from his long sleep, recognized his wife and his infant son, and reasserted control. York was pushed aside. The Queen's supporters regained power, and York raised an army. On the 22nd of May 1455, at the town of St Albans, the first battle of the Wars of the Roses was fought. It was a short, brutal engagement fought in the streets of the town. The Yorkists won. The king was captured, not killed, for York still claimed to be loyal to Henry, merely trying to remove evil counsellors from around him. But blood had been shed. Noble blood. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. Jasper Tudor was at that first battle, fighting for his half-brother the king. The Lancastrians lost, but Jasper survived. He escaped the field and continued to fight. This would be the pattern of his life. Defeat after defeat, but never surrender, never giving up. In the years that followed, there was an uneasy peace, then more conflict, then attempts at reconciliation that failed. Jasper was busy in Wales, strengthening his position, gathering supporters, fortifying castles. He became, effectively, the Lancastrian viceroy in Wales, the king's man in the Welsh territories. But his brother Edmund had a different path opening before him. In 1455, Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, married Lady Margaret Beaufort. She was only 12 years old, a great heiress, descended through her mother from John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. one of the sons of King Edward III. This made her, however distantly, part of the royal bloodline, the Lancastrian bloodline. The marriage was political, arranged to strengthen the Lancastrian cause. Edmund Tudor was 25. His bride was a child, but it was expected that she would soon be old enough to bear children. Children who would unite the Tudor and Beaufort lines. Children who would have a claim, however remote, to the English throne. Edmund and Margaret lived together as husband and wife, and in early 1456, young Margaret Beaufort became pregnant. She was only 13 years old, far too young for the dangers of childbirth. But there was no going back. And then, in November of 1456, disaster struck. Edmund Tudor was captured by Yorkist forces. He was imprisoned in Carmarthen Castle in Wales, and there, in that stone fortress, he fell ill. Some sources say it was the plague. Others say it was simply the poor conditions of imprisonment, the damp, the cold, the disease that festered in medieval prisons. Whatever the cause, Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, died in captivity on the 3rd of November 1456. He was only 26 years old. He would never meet his son. When the news reached Jasper, he must have felt the world tilt beneath him. His brother, his only full brother, the person who had been with him through all of it. The convent, the court, the rise to nobility, the battles. Edmund was gone, and Edmund's widow, Lady Margaret Beaufort, was still pregnant, still barely more than a child herself, now left without a husband, without protection, in a world growing ever more dangerous. Jasper Tudor did not hesitate. He rode to Pembroke Castle, where Margaret had taken refuge. He brought her under his protection. She was his sister-in-law now, carrying his brother's child. He would keep her safe. He would honor Edmund's memory by caring for those Edmund had left behind. In the cold January of 1457, in a chamber at Pembroke Castle, 13-year-old Margaret Beaufort went into labor. The birth was difficult, dangerous. She was so small, so young. The midwives must have feared for both mother and child. Jasper waited outside the chamber, perhaps pacing the stone corridors, perhaps praying in the castle chapel, and then the cries of a baby. A boy, healthy, strong-lunged, alive. Margaret survived, though barely. She had been so damaged by the birth that she would never have another child. But she had given Edmund Tudor a son, a posthumous son, born 3 months after his father's death. The baby was named Henry Tudor, and standing over the cradle, looking down at this tiny infant who would never know his father, was Jasper Tudor, the boy's uncle. In that moment, as Jasper Tudor looked at his infant nephew Henry, as he listened to the baby's cries and watched his sister-in-law Margaret recover slowly from her ordeal, in that moment, though he could not have known it, Jasper was looking at the future King of England. He was looking at Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor Dynasty. He was looking at the child who would, against all odds, end the Wars of the Roses and unite the kingdom. But in January of 1457, Henry Tudor was just a baby, just an orphan, just another small life trying to survive in a world at war. And Jasper became the protector, the guardian, the uncle who would raise this child, teach this child, and one day make this child a king. This was the meeting of fates. This was the moment when Jasper Tudor's life became forever intertwined with Henry Tudor's. From this point forward, everything Jasper did, every battle he fought, every exile he endured, every risk he took, it would all be for Henry. For the next few years, Jasper cared for both Margaret and young Henry. Margaret was technically the boy's guardian, but she was still so young herself, and the world was so dangerous. Jasper made sure they had everything they needed. He visited often. He watched the boy grow from infant to toddler. He saw Henry take his first steps in the great hall of Pembroke Castle, heard his first words, saw his first smiles. These were quiet years, relatively peaceful years. The Wars of the Roses had not yet reached their full fury. There were truces, negotiations, attempts at reconciliation. King Henry VI, Jasper's half-brother, tried to keep peace. Queen Margaret worked tirelessly to protect her son's right to inherit the throne, but the peace could not last. In 1459, the Duke of York rose in rebellion again. There were skirmishes, battles, political maneuvering. Jasper fought for the Lancastrian cause, leading Welsh troops in support of his half-brother the king. At one point, he achieved a significant victory. He captured Denbigh Castle in North Wales, a Yorkist stronghold, after a siege. It was a bright moment in an increasingly dark time. But then came 1460, and everything changed. In the summer of that year, the Yorkists won a great victory at the Battle of Northampton. King Henry VI was captured once again. The Duke of York entered London in triumph. For a moment, it seemed York might simply declare himself king. Instead, York made a compromise. King Henry VI would remain king for his lifetime, but when he died, York or his heirs would inherit the throne. Prince Edward, the son of Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, was disinherited. Queen Margaret would never accept this. Her son's birthright had been stolen. She fled north, gathered an army, and prepared to fight. And Jasper rallied his forces in Wales. His father, Owen Tudor, came out of his quiet life to join the cause. The old man was nearly 60 now, but he would fight for the stepson who had been kind to him, for the royal line his secret marriage had created. In late 1460 and early 1461, armies marched across England in the dead of winter. On the 30th of December 1460, the Duke of York was killed at the Battle of Wakefield. His head was cut off and displayed on the walls of York, wearing a paper crown. It was a brutal act, a sign of how savage the war had become. But York's death did not end the Yorkist cause. His eldest son, Edward, Earl of March, took up the fight. He was only 18 years old, but already he was a formidable warrior, tall, handsome, charismatic, and utterly ruthless. Edward of March was in the west of England when he heard that a Lancastrian force was marching from Wales. It was led by Jasper Tudor and his father Owen Tudor, along with the Earl of Wiltshire. They had landed at Milford Haven and were moving inland, planning to link up with Queen Margaret's main army. Edward decided to intercept them, to stop them before they could join forces with the Queen. The two armies met on February 2 or 3, 1461, near a place called Mortimer's Cross, close to the Welsh border. Jasper Tudor was about to fight the most significant battle of his life so far, and he was about to experience his most devastating loss. The dawn of that February morning was strange. A phenomenon appeared in the sky, 3 suns, or what seemed like 3 suns. It was a parhelion, an optical effect caused by ice crystals in the atmosphere. But to the medieval soldiers staring up at the heavens, it seemed like a sign from God. Edward of March told his troops that the 3 suns represented the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, showing that God was on the Yorkist side. His soldiers believed it. They were inspired. They would fight with the fury of men, convinced they served God's will. The Lancastrian army under Jasper and Owen Tudor was slightly larger, perhaps 6,000 men to the Yorkists' 5,000. But Jasper was not as experienced in military matters as Edward. The Earl of Wiltshire, his co-commander, was known more for his wealth than his tactical skill. The battle began around midday. It was fought across farmland, near the River Lug. The Yorkist archers poured arrows into the Lancastrian ranks. Hand-to-hand fighting broke out. The winter ground was churned to mud beneath thousands of feet. For a time, the outcome was uncertain. The Lancastrians pressed hard on Edward's forces, but Edward was a brilliant tactician, even at 18. He maneuvered his troops expertly. His soldiers fought with desperate courage, and slowly, gradually, the Lancastrian lines began to break. Jasper Tudor, in the thick of the fighting, must have seen it happening, must have felt the tide turning against him, must have realized that they were losing. The Lancastrian army shattered. Men fled in all directions, running for their lives. The Yorkists pursued them mercilessly, cutting down fleeing soldiers, taking prisoners, turning the field into a slaughterhouse. Jasper managed to escape. He rode hard through the winter countryside, heading for Wales and safety. He would live to fight another day. But his father, Owen Tudor, was not so fortunate. The old Welshman, nearly 60 years old, who had married a queen and fathered a dynasty, Owen Tudor was captured as he tried to flee. The Yorkists brought him to Hereford, about 17 miles from the battlefield. They threw him into the Green Dragon Inn, held him there overnight. Owen Tudor believed he would be ransomed or imprisoned. He had been the husband of a queen, the stepfather of a king. Surely he would be treated as a high-ranking prisoner. But the next morning, on the 4th of February 1461, Owen Tudor was brought out into the market square of Hereford, and there, for the first time, he saw the executioner's block. He saw the axe, and he understood. There would be no ransom, no imprisonment. Edward of March had ordered his execution. According to the chronicles, Owen Tudor was stunned. He had not believed, until that moment, that they would actually kill him. As the executioner ripped off his red collar to expose his neck, Owen is said to have remarked with bitter irony, "That head shall lie on the block that was wont to lie on Queen Katherine's lap." The axe fell. Owen Tudor's head was severed from his body, and then, in a final act of brutality, his head was placed atop the market cross in Hereford's central square, displayed for all to see. A local woman, some say driven mad by grief or perhaps just by pity, came to the market cross. She washed the blood from Owen's face. She combed his hair and beard. She placed candles around the severed head, 100 candles, the story says, burning in the winter light. When news of his father's death reached Jasper, he must have felt a grief almost beyond bearing. First his mother, dead when he was 5. Then his brother, Edmund, dead at 26. Now his father, beheaded like a traitor, his head displayed on a market cross for crows to peck at. Everyone Jasper had loved as a child. Everyone who had known him before he became Earl of Pembroke. They were gone. Only young Henry Tudor remained, the nephew, now 4 years old, still at Pembroke Castle, and Jasper's half-brother, King Henry VI, somewhere out there trying to hold on to his crumbling kingdom. The defeat at Mortimer's Cross was catastrophic for the Lancastrian cause. Combined with other Yorkist victories, it led to the complete collapse of King Henry VI's power. On the 4th of March 1461, Edward of March, the young warrior who had killed Jasper's father and scattered his army, was proclaimed King Edward IV of England. Henry VI and Queen Margaret fled north, trying to gather forces for a counterattack, but their cause seemed hopeless. And Jasper Tudor. Jasper was declared a traitor by the New Yorkist regime. His titles were forfeit, his lands were taken away, and given to a Yorkist nobleman named William Herbert. Pembroke Castle, where little Henry Tudor lived with his mother, was seized. Edward IV wanted Jasper captured, imprisoned, or dead. Jasper had no choice. He had to flee England. He had to leave behind his nephew Henry, leave behind the castle and the lands and the title he had held for less than 10 years. He had to run for his life. First, he fled to Ireland, then to Scotland, always moving, always looking over his shoulder, always wondering if Yorkist agents were closing in. In 1462, he made his way to France, where he was welcomed by King Louis XI, who was happy to shelter an enemy of England. Jasper was in exile, 30 years old, his family dead or scattered, his king in hiding, his cause seemingly lost. But he did not give up. Not then, not ever. From France, Jasper began planning, gathering supporters, seeking allies, trying to find a way to restore King Henry VI to the throne, to reclaim what had been taken from him, to avenge his father's death. And always, in the back of his mind, the thought of young Henry Tudor, left behind at Pembroke Castle, now in the custody of William Herbert, the Yorkist who had been given Jasper's title and lands. Jasper could not protect his nephew from exile. He could not be there to watch Henry grow up, to teach him, to keep him safe. All he could do was survive and wait and plan for the day when he might return. The shadows had fallen across Jasper Tudor's life. The bright years at court, the power and title, the pride of serving his king, all of it swept away in a few years of brutal war. Now he walked in the darkness of exile, a man hunted by his enemies, separated from everyone he loved. But the darkness would not last forever. And Jasper Tudor, the man born in scandal, the boy raised in a convent, the warrior who never gave up, he was patient. He could wait in the shadows. He could endure, because someday, though he did not yet know when or how, someday he would return, and when he did, he would bring with him the vengeance of a son who had seen his father beheaded, the fury of an uncle separated from his nephew, the loyalty of a half-brother who would never abandon his king. The shadows had fallen, but in the shadows, plans were being made. Exile has a particular taste, a particular weight. It settles into your bones like winter cold that never quite leaves. For Jasper Tudor, exile meant wandering from court to court, from Scotland to France to Ireland and back again, always a guest, never truly home, always plotting, always planning, always hoping for the chance to return. He was 30 years old in 1462 when he arrived at the court of King Louis XI of France. The French king was a shrewd, calculating man who saw value in sheltering England's exiles. If the Yorkist king Edward IV had enemies, well, those enemies might prove useful to France someday. And so Jasper was welcomed, given a modest pension, allowed to stay. But welcome did not mean peace. Welcome did not mean giving up the fight. From France, Jasper watched events in England unfold like a man watching a house burn from across a river, close enough to see every detail, too far away to do anything about it. King Henry VI and Queen Margaret had fled to Scotland, still clinging to hope, still gathering what forces they could. There were battles, skirmishes, raids across the Scottish border into northern England. The Lancastrian cause was not yet dead. And then, in the autumn of 1462, came an opportunity. Queen Margaret of Anjou had made a deal with the French king. In exchange for military support, she had promised to give Calais, England's last possession in France, to the French crown. It was a desperate bargain, selling England's patrimony for the chance to regain the throne. But she was desperate. With French support, a new invasion was planned, and Jasper Tudor was at the heart of it. In late 1462, Jasper landed in northern England at the head of a small invasion force. He was joined by other Lancastrian nobles, men who had also been in exile, men who had also lost everything. Together, they managed to capture several castles along the Scottish border, including the great fortress of Bamborough. For a few brief weeks, it seemed the tide might be turning. The Lancastrian forces held the north. King Henry VI was with them, his presence lending legitimacy to their cause. Maybe, just maybe, they could march south, gather more support, challenge Edward IV's hold on the throne. But it was not to be. Edward IV moved swiftly, bringing a powerful army north. The Lancastrians found themselves besieged in their newly captured castles, surrounded, outnumbered. By December of 1462, it became clear that the invasion had failed. Jasper negotiated a surrender. In exchange for safe passage back to Scotland, he and his fellow Lancastrians abandoned their conquests. It was a humiliating retreat, but at least they lived to fight another day. Jasper made his way back to Scotland, then eventually returned to France, where he continued his patient exile. The years that followed became a pattern. Jasper would hear news of fighting in England, would make plans to return, would sometimes manage to sail across the Channel and land in Wales or northern England, would fight for a few weeks or months, and then would be forced to flee again when Yorkist forces grew too strong. In 1468, he returned to Wales to try to relieve Harlech Castle, one of the last Lancastrian strongholds which had been under siege for years. He managed to get close, to see the great castle perched on its rocky crag overlooking the sea. But William Herbert, the man who had been given Jasper's title of Earl of Pembroke, the man who now held Pembroke Castle in custody of young Henry Tudor, brought a Yorkist army to stop him. Jasper was defeated again. He fled to the continent again, and William Herbert was rewarded for his loyalty to Edward IV. He was confirmed as Earl of Pembroke. He was given more lands and power, and he kept control of young Henry Tudor. Jasper must have thought constantly about his nephew during these years. Henry would be growing up in Herbert's household at Raglan Castle, a magnificent fortress in Wales. Herbert was not a cruel man. He raised Henry as a nobleman should be raised, teaching him to ride and hunt and fight. But he was a Yorkist, an enemy of everything Jasper stood for. And young Henry was being raised by his uncle's enemies, learning to live in a world where the Yorkist king Edward IV sat on the throne and the Lancastrian cause seemed hopeless. Did Henry even remember Jasper? He had been only 4 years old when Jasper fled into exile. Now he was 11, 12, 13, a boy becoming a young man, and Jasper had not seen him in almost a decade. But then, in 1469 to 1470, something extraordinary happened, something that would bring Jasper back to England and reunite him with his nephew, if only briefly. The great Yorkist noble Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known as the KINGMAKER, because he had helped Edward IV win the throne, turned against his king. Warwick had many reasons for his betrayal. He had been slighted, ignored, his advice rejected. Edward IV had married for love rather than politics, choosing a beautiful widow named Elizabeth Woodville instead of the foreign Princess Warwick had negotiated with. The Queen's family, the Woodvilles, had risen to power and influence, pushing aside Warwick. And so Warwick did the unthinkable. He allied with his former enemies, the Lancastrians. He made a deal with Queen Margaret of Anjou, who was still in France with her son, Prince Edward. Warwick would help restore King Henry VI to the throne. In return, his daughter would marry Prince Edward, uniting the houses of York and Lancaster through marriage. It was a stunning reversal. And Jasper Tudor was part of the plan. In September of 1470, Warwick landed in England with an army. King Edward IV, caught by surprise, fled to Burgundy. And just like that, after nearly 10 years of Yorkist rule, Henry VI was restored to the throne. The old king was brought out of the Tower of London, where he had been imprisoned. He was in his late 40s now, his mind fragile, his spirit broken by years of captivity and the mental illness that had plagued him all his life. But he was still the king, still anointed, still the man Jasper had sworn to serve. Jasper Tudor returned to England in triumph. His titles were restored. Pembroke Castle was his again, and most importantly, he was reunited with his nephew, Henry. Imagine that meeting. Jasper had last seen Henry as a small child of 4. Now Henry was 13, nearly 14, on the edge of manhood. Had he grown tall? Did he look like his father Edmund? What did they say to each other? Uncle and nephew meeting again after so many years. We don't know the words they spoke, but we know what happened next. Jasper brought Henry to London, to the court, to meet King Henry VI. The old king looked at the young boy standing before him. This was Edmund Tudor's son, the child of his beloved half-brother, the boy with Beaufort blood through his mother's line. Henry VI blessed young Henry Tudor. Some sources say the king had a moment of prophetic clarity, a vision through the fog of his damaged mind. He said that this boy, this young Henry Tudor, would one day bring peace to England, would one day unite the warring factions, would one day be king. It seemed like madness at the time. This boy had almost no claim to the throne. His mother's Beaufort line had been explicitly barred from the succession by King Henry IV years before. His father's Tudor line was founded on an irregular marriage between a Welsh squire and a queen. Young Henry Tudor had no armies, no lands of his own, no great nobles supporting him. The idea that he would be king, it was absurd. But Jasper remembered those words. He kept them in his heart, in the shadows where he stored all his hopes and plans. The brief restoration of King Henry VI, later called the Readeption, lasted only 6 months. 6 months of Lancastrian rule, of Jasper having his castle back, of being able to stay in one place without fear of arrest. But Edward IV, exiled in Burgundy, was not finished. He gathered support, raised an army, and in March of 1471 he landed in England, ready to reclaim his crown. Jasper was in Wales when the news came. He immediately began raising troops. gathering a Welsh army to march to the king's support. But armies take time to gather, and events moved swiftly. On the 14th of April 1471, at the Battle of Barnet, just outside London, the Yorkist forces under Edward IV met the Lancastrian army commanded by the Earl of Warwick. It was a confused, fog-shrouded battle fought at dawn. Warwick's forces mistook each other for enemies in the mist and began fighting amongst themselves. The battle turned into a rout. Warwick himself was killed, cut down as he tried to flee. The great kingmaker, who had put 2 kings on England's throne, died in a field surrounded by enemies. When news of Barnet reached Queen Margaret of Anjou, who had only just arrived in England with her son Prince Edward, she must have despaired. But she was a fighter, always a fighter. She would not give up. She gathered her forces and marched north, trying to link up with Jasper's Welsh army. Jasper, somewhere in Wales with his hastily assembled troops, was racing to reach her. If they could combine their forces, they might still have a chance. Queen Margaret had brought French mercenaries. Jasper had Welsh soldiers loyal to the Lancastrian cause. Together, they might stand against Edward IV, but they never managed to meet. On the 4th of May 1471, at Tewkesbury in Gloucestershire, Edward IV caught Queen Margaret's army before Jasper could reach them. The Battle of Tewkesbury was a disaster for the Lancastrians. They were utterly destroyed. Thousands were killed. Many nobles who had supported the Lancastrian cause were captured and executed. And worst of all, Prince Edward, the son of Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, the Lancastrian heir to the throne, the young man who was supposed to be the future of the dynasty. He was killed. Some say he died in battle. Others say he was captured and murdered afterward. Either way, he was dead. The direct Lancastrian line, gone. Within days, King Henry VI himself died in the Tower of London. The official story was that he died of melancholy upon hearing of his son's death, but everyone knew the truth. He was murdered on Edward IV's orders, killed to prevent any future rallying around the Lancastrian king. Jasper Tudor, somewhere in Western England, received all this terrible news in the span of a few days. Barnet lost, Tewkesbury lost, Prince Edward dead, King Henry VI dead. The cause was finished. The war was over. The Yorkists had won completely. And Jasper was once again hunted, once again fleeing for his life. But this time, he was not alone. This time, he had his nephew with him. Henry Tudor had been at Jasper's side during the brief 6 months of Lancastrian restoration. Now, with the Yorkist triumph, the boy was in mortal danger. Edward IV might show mercy to some of the defeated Lancastrians, but young Henry Tudor, he was a potential threat. With the direct Lancastrian line extinct, Henry's tenuous claim through his mother's Beaufort blood suddenly mattered more. Not much more, but enough to make him dangerous to leave alive. Edward IV sent his agents to hunt for Jasper and Henry. He sent soldiers to capture them, imprison them, likely execute them. Jasper and his 14-year-old nephew fled west into Wales, heading for the coast. They were being pursued. Behind them, Edward IV's forces were closing in. One of those pursuing Yorkist commanders was Sir Roger Vaughan, and Vaughan had a special reason to want Jasper dead. It was Vaughan who had led Owen Tudor to his execution 10 years earlier. But in a twist of fate, in a moment of fierce justice, Jasper captured Vaughan before Vaughan could capture him. And Jasper Tudor, who was usually merciful, who usually followed the codes of honor, executed Roger Vaughan, had him beheaded, just as Vaughan had led Jasper's father to the block. 10 years of grief, 10 years of rage, 10 years of loss, all of it came out in that one act of vengeance. Then Jasper and Henry ran again. They made it to Chepstow, to Margaret Beaufort, Henry's mother, Edmund's widow, Jasper's sister-in-law. Margaret helped them escape. She arranged for horses, for supplies, for a guide who could take them to the coast. They rode hard for Tenby, a coastal town in Pembrokeshire, Wales. Jasper had friends there, connections from his years as Earl of Pembroke. The mayor of Tenby, Thomas White, hid them in his house while Yorkist soldiers searched the town. There is a legend that Jasper and Henry hid in the cellars, listening to soldiers' boots on the streets above. breathing quietly in the darkness, waiting for discovery that never came. Finally, when it was safe, they made their way to the harbour. A ship was waiting. Jasper had arranged passage. Their destination was France, where Jasper still had allies, where they could find safety. But the sea had other plans. They set sail in late summer of 1471, but almost immediately, a storm struck. The kind of storm that medieval sailors feared more than anything. Walls of water, screaming wind, the ship pitching and rolling, everyone certain they were about to drown. The storm blew them off course. They had no choice but to run before the wind, hoping to survive. When they finally managed to approach land again, they were nowhere near France. They were off the coast of Brittany, the independent duchy that was France's neighbour and sometimes rival. They landed at a small fishing port called Le Conquet. Jasper and Henry stumbled ashore, soaked, exhausted, grateful to be alive. They had escaped Edward IV. They had survived the sea, but now they were in Brittany and they had no idea what kind of reception they would receive. The Duke of Brittany was Francis II, a cautious ruler trying to maintain his duchy's independence from an increasingly powerful France. He had his own political calculations to make. Would he help these Lancastrian exiles? Would he hand them over to Edward IV? Would he use them as pawns in his diplomatic games? Jasper and Henry were brought to the ducal court. They explained who they were, why they had come, and Duke Francis decided to grant them sanctuary. It was a political decision, not a purely charitable one. Having the Lancastrian exiles in his custody gave Francis leverage with both France and England. He could trade them, use them to negotiate favourable terms, keep them as a diplomatic asset. But whatever his motives, Duke Francis's protection meant that Jasper and Henry were safe. For now, they were given accommodations at the Château de l'Hermine in Vannes, the ducal capital. It was comfortable enough, but it was not freedom. They were, essentially, prisoners. Polite prisoners, honoured prisoners, but prisoners nonetheless. Edward IV sent envoys to Brittany, demanding that the exiles be handed over. Francis refused, but he also made sure Jasper and Henry couldn't leave. He replaced their English servants with his own Breton attendants. He kept them under close watch. Then, in October of 1472, fearing that Edward IV might try to kidnap the exiles, Duke Francis moved them to a more secure location, the Château de Suscinio, a remote fortress on the coast of southern Brittany, far from any potential English raiding party. And there, in that coastal castle, with the sound of the sea always in their ears and the salt smell in the air, Jasper and Henry Tudor began what would be 14 years of exile. 14 years. Jasper was 40 years old when he arrived. He would be 54 when he finally left. Henry was 14 when they arrived. He would be 28 when they finally escaped. 14 years is long enough for a boy to become a man, long enough for hope to fade, then return, then fade again, long enough to forget what England looks like, what home feels like, long enough to wonder if you'll ever return, or if exile is simply life now. For Jasper, those years must have been both peaceful and agonizing. Peaceful because there was no war, no running, no constant fear of capture and execution. The Château de Suscinio was a pleasant enough place. It sat on the edge of the ocean, surrounded by woods and marshland. There was hunting, fishing, time to read and think and rest after decades of war. But agonizing because he was in his prime, a skilled warrior and leader, and he was doing nothing. His half-brother was dead. His cause had lost. His titles and lands in England belonged to someone else. He was Earl of Pembroke in name only, a shadow earl in a shadow existence. And what about young Henry? Jasper took on the role of mentor, teacher, guardian. He taught Henry everything he knew about warfare, politics, survival, how to lead men in battle, how to negotiate with nobles, how to wait patiently for the right moment, how to endure when all seemed lost. They studied together. The classics, history, the lives of great kings and failed kings. They practiced swordplay and archery. They rode horses through the Breton countryside. They learned to speak French fluently. Not the French of Katherine of Valois that Jasper remembered from childhood, but the Breton-accented French of their new home. At times, Duke Francis separated them. Jasper was moved to the Château de Josselin, where he was kept in comfortable but guarded quarters. Henry was sent to the Forteresse de l'Argoais, where he was entrusted to the care of the Marshal of Brittany, a nobleman with sons Henry's age. Perhaps Francis thought separating them would make them easier to control, or perhaps he worried that if they were together, they might plot an escape. But whether together or apart, Jasper and Henry remained connected. They sent messages when they could. They held on to the same dream, that someday, somehow, they would return to England, that someday the Yorkist regime would crumble, that someday Henry Tudor, against all odds, might have a chance at the throne that old King Henry VI had prophesied for him. It must have seemed like madness. Henry had no army. No great nobles backed his claim. His mother's Beaufort line was barred from the succession. He was a nobody, an exile, a forgotten younger son of a forgotten family. But Jasper never stopped believing, never stopped planning, never stopped teaching Henry to be ready for the chance that might never come. The years passed slowly in Brittany. In England, Edward IV ruled successfully. He was a popular king, handsome and vigorous. He won battles, made advantageous alliances, filled the treasury. The Wars of the Roses seemed to be over. The Yorkist dynasty seemed secure, but there were always whispers. Whispers about the two princes, Edward IV's own nephews, who had disappeared in the Tower of London. Whispers about Edward IV's own legitimacy. Whispers that perhaps the peace was not as secure as it seemed. In France, King Louis XI kept a careful watch on Brittany and its valuable prisoners. He occasionally made overtures to Jasper and Henry, suggesting they come to France instead. But Duke Francis wouldn't allow it. They were his pawns, and he would keep them. And so the years passed. Jasper grew older, his hair greying, his body still strong but showing the years of war and exile. Henry grew from adolescence to manhood, learning patience in the only school that truly teaches it, enforced waiting. They were together for some of those years, separated for others, but always united in purpose. Jasper was raising a king. He might not have fully believed it himself sometimes, but he was doing it nonetheless, teaching Henry everything he would need to know to rule England, if that impossible day ever came. Let us pause in those years of exile, by the light of candles in a Breton castle, and imagine the daily life of Jasper and Henry Tudor during their long wait in the shadows. The Château de Sousigno, where they spent much of their exile, sat on the edge of the marshlands of southern Brittany. It was a hunting lodge more than a fortress, though strong enough to withstand any attempt to kidnap the valuable English exiles. The castle's towers looked out over wetlands where herons stalked through the reeds, and the sea was never far away. Jasper would wake each morning in his chamber. Stone walls, a narrow window looking out over the marsh, a fire in the hearth that servants kept burning through the night to ward off the damp. He was in his 40s during those years, then his early 50s, an age when a man feels the cold more keenly, when old battle wounds ache on rainy days. He would dress himself or be helped by a servant. The simple clothes of a nobleman in exile, not the elaborate court dress he might have worn in England. There was no one here to impress except Duke Francis's guards and the few fellow exiles who shared this strange existence. Breakfast would be bread and ale, perhaps some fish from the local waters. Simple fare, not the feasts of a great nobleman. Money was always tight. Duke Francis provided them with a living allowance, but it was modest. They had to manage their expenses carefully, make their clothes last, economize in ways that would have been unthinkable in their former lives. After breakfast, Jasper would often spend time with Henry. If they were together at the chateau, if Duke Francis had not separated them to different locations, the relationship between uncle and nephew deepened during these years, forged in the fires of shared exile and mutual dependence. What did they do to fill the endless days? They studied. Jasper ensured that Henry continued his education. There were books, brought from England or acquired in France, Latin texts, histories of ancient Rome and recent England. the Bible and religious commentaries. Jasper might not have been a great scholar himself, but he knew the value of learning. A king needed to be educated, needed to understand law and statecraft, needed to speak Latin with church officials and French with foreign ambassadors. They practiced military skills. In the castle courtyard, Jasper would drill Henry in swordsmanship, archery, horseback riding. Even in exile, even when it seemed they would never return to England, Jasper insisted on these lessons. A nobleman must know how to fight, he would say, and a king even more so. The two of them, uncle and nephew, would spend hours practicing. The clash of practice swords, the thud of arrows into targets, the thunder of hooves as they rode. They talked of England endlessly. Jasper would tell Henry stories of the realm he barely remembered. What was London like? The great city with its bridge spanning the Thames, its towers and churches, its markets full of merchants from every land. What was the royal court like? The ceremonies and feasts, the nobles in their finery, the king upon his throne dispensing justice. What were the English people like? Proud, stubborn, prone to rebellion, but fiercely loyal once their loyalty was won. And they planned. Oh, how they planned. Even when it seemed hopeless, even when years passed with no change, they planned for the day they would return. Jasper would spread maps on a table in his chamber, and they would study the geography of England. Where would they land? Pembroke in Wales, perhaps. Jasper's old territory, where he still had friends and connections. How would they march to London? Through the Welsh borders, gathering supporters as they went. Who might support them? The Stanley family. Lord Stanley was married to Margaret Beaufort, so he was Henry's stepfather. Surely he could be won over. And other disaffected nobles, men who chafed under Yorkist rule, men who might be persuaded that a new dynasty was worth the risk. But interspersed with these practical discussions were darker moments. Moments when the weight of exile pressed down on both of them. Moments when Jasper, looking at his nephew, wondered if he had wasted the boy's life on a hopeless cause. Henry was in his teens, then his 20s, the years when a young nobleman should be establishing himself, making advantageous marriages, building a career. Instead, he was trapped in Brittany, a nobody, living on Duke Francis's charity, with no prospects and no future. Did Jasper ever despair? Did he ever think, I should let Henry make peace with Edward IV, should let him return to England as a loyal subject, should let him have a normal life instead of this endless waiting? Perhaps. In the darkest nights, when the wind howled off the marsh and the rain beat against the stone walls, perhaps Jasper questioned everything. But if he did, he never showed it to Henry. Always he was confident. Always he was determined. Always he believed that someday, somehow, they would return. And Henry learned from this. Learned patience. Learned determination. Learned that success often comes not to those who give up when times are hard, but to those who endure when endurance seems pointless. The relationship between them was complex. Part father and son, part teacher and student, part comrades in adversity. Jasper had raised Henry from infancy. He had been more present in Henry's life than Edmund Tudor ever could have been. But there was also a distance between them. Jasper was still the great nobleman, the Earl, the man who commanded respect. Henry was the younger man who deferred to his elders' wisdom. Yet, as the years passed, as Henry matured from adolescent to adult, the dynamic began to shift. Henry developed his own opinions, his own ideas. He was naturally cautious, more inclined to wait and calculate than to act boldly. This was partly Jasper's influence, but it was also Henry's own nature. The two of them would sometimes disagree about strategy, about whom to trust, about when to attempt a return to England. But always, underlying everything, was the deep bond of love and mutual loyalty. Jasper loved Henry as he might have loved a son of his own body. Henry loved and revered Jasper as the man who had sacrificed everything for him, who had given up a comfortable life in England to live in exile for Henry's sake. They were bound together by more than blood. They were bound by shared experience, by the years of waiting, by the dream they both held of someday returning to England. and setting right what had been wronged. Sometimes, on better days, they would go hunting in the Breton forests. Duke Francis allowed them this freedom, riding out with hawks or hounds, pursuing deer or wild boar through the woods. These were among the happiest times of their exile. The two of them on horseback, the thrill of the chase, the camaraderie of the hunt. For a few hours they could forget they were exiles, could pretend they were simply noblemen enjoying their estates. Other times they would walk along the coast, watching the sea crash against the rocks, breathing in the salt air. Jasper, who had sailed across these waters multiple times, who had been shipwrecked and storm-tossed, had a complicated relationship with the sea. It had brought him to safety when he fled England. It had nearly drowned him more than once. It was the barrier that separated him from home and the pathway that might someday take him back. Standing on the Breton shore, looking north toward England that lay somewhere beyond the horizon, Jasper must have felt the pull of home, the longing to see Pembroke Castle again, to walk through Welsh valleys, to hear English voices instead of French. But he would turn away from the sea, would return to the chateau, would resume the daily routines of exile, waiting, always waiting. When Duke Francis separated Jasper and Henry, sending them to different locations to make them harder to kidnap, the separation must have been difficult for both. They had been together for so long, had relied on each other so completely. Now Jasper was at the Château de Josselin, effectively under house arrest, though treated well. Henry was at the Forteresse de l'Argoais with the Marshal of Brittany. During these periods of separation, they communicated through letters when they could. Medieval letters were formal things, carefully worded because the writer never knew who might intercept them. But between the formal phrases, uncle and nephew found ways to reassure each other, to maintain the connection, to remember they were not alone, even when physically apart. Jasper's letters would remind Henry to continue his studies, to practice his riding, to maintain his skills at arms. They would include news of the political situation, what was happening in England, what Edward IV was doing, which nobles were in favour and which had fallen from grace. And they would always end with reassurance. "We will return," Jasper would write. "Keep faith. Our day will come." Henry's letters to his uncle were more circumspect, more guarded. He had been raised to be cautious, to trust few people, to keep his thoughts to himself. But even in the formal language of his letters, Jasper could read between the lines. He could sense when Henry was discouraged, when he needed encouragement, when he was holding up well under the strain of their situation. And then they would be reunited, brought back to the same chateau after months or years apart, and the relief was palpable. They would have so much to discuss, so much to catch up on, so many plans to make. The exiles in Brittany formed a small community, English and Welsh men who had fled the Yorkist regime, who lived on Duke Francis's charity, who dreamed of returning home someday. Jasper was the senior member of this community, the man others looked to for leadership. He had to settle disputes, offer counsel, maintain morale when spirits flagged. It was a responsibility he took seriously. These men had sacrificed everything for the Lancastrian cause, their lands, their positions, their comfortable lives. They deserved a leader who would not give up on them, who would keep working toward the day when they could all go home. So Jasper kept the flame alive, kept talking about England, kept planning for return, kept insisting that Edward IV's regime would not last forever, that opportunities would come. And slowly, year by year, the Lancastrian exiles in Brittany remained united, remained loyal, remained ready. The turning point came in 1483, when Edward IV died. The news reached Brittany like a thunderclap. The Yorkist king was dead, his son was a child, and his brother Richard was making a play for the throne. Suddenly, after years of stagnation, events were moving again. Jasper immediately understood what this meant. The Yorkist regime was vulnerable. Edward IV had been a strong king, popular with the people, secure on his throne, but a child king and a controversial regent. This was opportunity. He and Henry began receiving letters from England, from Margaret Beaufort, from disaffected Yorkist nobles, from men who were horrified by Richard III's seizure of power. and the disappearance of the princes in the Tower, a coalition was forming. Former Yorkists who hated Richard, old Lancastrians who saw a chance to regain power, and Henry Tudor as the figurehead around whom they could rally. Jasper worked frantically through the summer and fall of 1483, preparing for an invasion. This was it. This was the moment they had waited 13 years for. Duke Francis was willing to help, providing ships and supplies. Money came from supporters in England. Soldiers were recruited. And then, disaster. The failed invasion attempt. The storms. The betrayal. Back to Brittany in defeat. Back to the chateau. Back to waiting. But even in defeat, Jasper did not despair. Richard III was not secure on his throne. The alliance with Elizabeth Woodville still held. Henry had promised to marry Elizabeth of York when he became king, uniting Lancaster and York. The exiles were still intact, still loyal, still ready. They just had to wait a little longer, just had to endure a little more. And in 1484, when Pierre Landais betrayed them, when they had to flee to France in the middle of the night, when everything seemed lost yet again, even then, Jasper kept going. Even then, he organized, planned, prepared, because that was what he did. That was who he was. Jasper Tudor, the man who never gave up, the uncle who would do anything, endure anything, sacrifice anything to protect his nephew and restore the Lancastrian cause. The years in Brittany had shaped both of them profoundly. Henry emerged from exile as a careful, calculating man, slow to trust, reluctant to take risks, but also determined, resilient, unwilling to give up even when everything seemed hopeless. These were Jasper's gifts to him, the lessons learned through years of patient endurance. And Jasper himself was shaped by those years too. He entered exile at 40 years old, still relatively young, still vigorous. He left it at 54, an old man by medieval standards. The years had taken their toll. The anxiety, the poverty, the uncertainty, but they had also refined him, stripped away everything except his essential core of loyalty and determination. When they finally sailed from France in August 1485, when they landed in Wales and began the march that would end at Bosworth Field, both of them were ready. Ready not just with armies and alliances, but with the inner strength forged through 14 years of exile, ready to endure whatever came, to face whatever challenges awaited, to see the cause through to its end, whether that end was victory or death. That readiness, that inner strength, it was the gift of the exile years, the years in the shadows of Brittany, the years that history largely forgets, the years that seemed wasted at the time but which proved to be the essential preparation for everything that followed. In 1483, everything changed again. On April 9 of that year, King Edward IV died suddenly, unexpectedly, at the age of only 40. He left behind two sons, Edward, now 12 years old and rightfully King Edward V, and Richard, 10 years old. The boys were in the care of their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward IV's younger brother. And Richard decided he wanted the throne for himself. Within weeks, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had declared Edward IV's marriage invalid, making Edward IV's children illegitimate. He had himself crowned King Richard III. The two young princes, Edward V and his brother, were placed in the Tower of London and were never seen again. Even in distant Brittany, Jasper and Henry heard the news. England was in turmoil. Many nobles who had supported the Yorkist dynasty were horrified. The princes had been murdered, almost certainly on Richard III's orders. The king was a usurper, a child killer, and suddenly, Henry Tudor's tenuous claim to the throne didn't seem so absurd anymore. If Edward IV's children were illegitimate, if the princes were dead, if Richard III was a usurper, then who had a better claim than Henry? His mother's Beaufort blood connected him to John of Gaunt, Edward III's son. Yes, the Beauforts had been barred from the succession, but desperate times called for flexible interpretations of old laws. Rebellions broke out in England. Nobles who had served Edward IV began to turn against Richard III. One of the conspirators was Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham. who had helped Richard seize the throne but now regretted it. And in that moment, sitting in his chamber at the chateau, Jasper Tudor saw opportunity. He and Henry began receiving messages from England, secret letters smuggled across the Channel. Margaret Beaufort, Henry's mother, was involved in the conspiracy. She was working with Elizabeth Woodville, Edward IV's widow, mother of the disappeared princes, to forge an alliance. The plan was audacious. If Henry Tudor would invade England and claim the throne, if he would promise to marry Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter, then the Yorkist nobles who hated Richard III would support him. The Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York would be united through marriage, ending the Civil War. It was Henry's chance. The impossible chance they had waited 13 years for. Jasper began planning the invasion. Ships were arranged. Money was gathered. Soldiers were recruited. In October of 1483, Henry and Jasper prepared to sail for England with a small fleet. But Duke Francis heard about the plan, and he panicked. He feared England's wrath if he openly supported an invasion. He ordered Jasper and Henry confined more closely, prevented them from leaving. They managed to slip away anyway. The fleet sailed, but it ran into terrible storms in the English Channel. The ships were scattered. Only one or two made it close enough to the English coast to see land. And there, waiting on the shore, soldiers. Richard III had been warned. The invasion had been betrayed. If Henry tried to land, he would be captured immediately. Jasper made the hard decision. They turned back, sailed back to Brittany in defeat. The rebellion in England collapsed. The Duke of Buckingham was captured and executed. The conspirators were arrested or fled. Henry's mother Margaret was placed under house arrest, accused of treason. It had been so close, and now it seemed further away than ever. Back in Brittany, back in the chateau that was half palace and half prison, Jasper and Henry had to reckon with their failure. They had risked everything, and it had come to nothing. But they were still alive, and as long as they lived, there was hope. Richard III was not secure on his throne. The disappeared princes haunted his reign. Every day brought new whispers, new accusations, new rebellions brewing. And across the Channel, in Brittany, Jasper Tudor and his nephew Henry waited, planning, preparing. The deepening bond between uncle and nephew, forged in those years of exile, was stronger than blood. It was the bond of shared suffering, shared dreams, shared determination. Jasper had raised Henry more than Edmund ever could have. Jasper had taught Henry what it meant to be a Tudor, what it meant to serve the Lancastrian cause, what it meant to wait patiently in the shadows for your moment to strike. And that moment, though they could not yet see it clearly, that moment was coming. The year 1484 began quietly for Jasper and Henry, still in Brittany, still waiting. But quiet moments in history often hide gathering storms. And in the summer of that year, the storm broke in a way that could have destroyed everything. Duke Francis II of Brittany fell gravely ill. Some kind of fever or sickness of the mind seized him, leaving him incapacitated, unable to govern. And into that power vacuum stepped a man named Pierre Landais. Landais was the Duke's treasurer, a clever and ambitious man who had risen from relatively humble origins to become one of the most powerful figures in Brittany. With Duke Francis unable to rule, Landais effectively took control of the government, and Landais saw an opportunity to improve his own position and that of Brittany. King Richard III of England had been putting pressure on Brittany for years, demanding that Henry Tudor and Jasper be handed over. He offered rewards, threats, diplomatic agreements. Duke Francis had always resisted. But Landais was not Duke Francis. Landais sent secret envoys to King Richard. They negotiated a deal. England would provide Brittany with 3,000 archers to help defend against a threatened French attack. In exchange, Brittany would return Henry Tudor and Jasper Tudor to England. It was a death sentence disguised as a diplomatic agreement. If Henry and Jasper were handed over to Richard III, they would not live long. They would be executed as traitors, as threats to the throne, as the last remnants of the Lancastrian cause. But news of the plot leaked out. One of the English exiles in Brittany learned what Landais was planning. Word was sent to other Lancastrian sympathizers, and eventually, the warning reached a crucial person, John Morton, the Bishop of Ely, who was in exile in Flanders. Bishop Morton immediately sent an urgent message to Henry and Jasper. The message was stark, desperate. Flee. Flee now. Landais's soldiers are coming to arrest you. You have hours, maybe less. The message reached the chateau where Jasper and Henry were staying. Can you imagine that moment? Jasper, now 53 years old, had been in exile for most of his adult life. He had endured so much, waited so long, prepared so carefully, and now, betrayal from an unexpected quarter threatened to end everything. There was no time to plan, no time to gather belongings, no time for anything except running. They decided to split up, to give themselves a better chance of at least one of them escaping. Henry would go one way, Jasper another. They would try to reach the French border, only a few miles away. If they could cross into France, Landais's soldiers couldn't touch them. Henry left first, disguised as a servant, with only one or two companions. He rode hard for the border, his heart pounding, expecting any moment to hear soldiers' hoofbeats behind him, to feel the hand on his shoulder that meant capture and death. Jasper left hours later, also in disguise, also riding for his life. Behind them both, they later learned, Landais's soldiers arrived at the chateau and found their birds had flown. The soldiers set off in pursuit. It was the closest they had come to capture in 13 years. Hours, just hours, separated Henry and Jasper from arrest. But by the grace of God, or luck, or their own desperate speed, they made it. First, Henry crossed the border into France, stumbling into a French town, gasping for breath, hardly believing he had escaped. Then Jasper, arriving separately, equally exhausted, equally grateful to be alive. They had lost everything they had in Brittany, their belongings, their servants, their comfortable chambers, but they were free, and they were together again. The French, of course, were delighted to receive them. France and England were always rivals, and anything that troubled England pleased France. King Charles VIII, who was only a boy at the time, with his kingdom ruled by his older sister, Anne of Beaujeu, welcomed the English exiles. He provided them with money, lodgings, and most importantly, support for an invasion of England. This time, there would be no half measures. This time, they would do it properly. Jasper and Henry were given resources to recruit an army. French mercenaries were hired. Ships were purchased or leased. Weapons were stockpiled. Supplies were gathered. And meanwhile, in Brittany, Duke Francis II recovered from his illness. When he learned what had happened, how his treasurer had nearly handed over his guests to their enemies, he was horrified. He sent apologies to Henry and Jasper. He sent money to help them. And he told the several hundred Lancastrian exiles who still remained in Brittany that they could leave, that he would even pay their travel expenses to France. So now, in France, Henry Tudor had not just a few companions. He had a small army of English exiles, men who had been waiting in Brittany for years, men who had lost everything to the Yorkist regime, men who were ready to fight. Jasper worked tirelessly through late 1484 and into 1485, preparing for the invasion. He had been a military commander for decades. He knew how to organize an army, how to motivate men, how to plan a campaign. This was what he had been preparing for all his life. This moment when he would finally lead his nephew back to England, back to claim the throne. Henry, at 28 years old, was no longer the 14-year-old boy who had fled with Jasper from Wales. He was a man now, hardened by exile, educated by Jasper in all the arts of kingship and war. He was cautious, calculating, patient. He had learned from his uncle that victory often went not to the boldest, but to the most careful, to those who waited for the right moment rather than charging in recklessly. All through the spring and early summer of 1485, the preparations continued. Money arrived from Margaret Beaufort, Henry's mother, who despite being under house arrest in England had found ways to smuggle funds across the Channel. Promises of support came from discontented English nobles who hated Richard III. Plans were made, contingencies discussed, maps studied. And in England, Richard III knew what was coming. He knew Henry Tudor and Jasper were in France. He knew they were gathering an army. He sent spies to France, trying to learn the details. He mustered troops in England, preparing for the invasion he knew would come. He sent proclamations declaring Henry Tudor a traitor, warning anyone who supported the invasion that they would face death for treason. But despite all of Richard's preparations, he could not stop what was coming. The invasion fleet assembled at the Norman port of Harfleur, just across the channel from England. Jasper and Henry walked the docks, inspecting the ships, talking to the soldiers, checking supplies. On the 1st of August 1485, the fleet sailed. The ships carried perhaps 2,000 men, French mercenaries, Breton soldiers, English and Welsh exiles. It was not a huge force. Edward IV or Richard III could probably field 10,000 men or more, but it was enough. It had to be enough. The crossing took a week. The ships made their way around the coast of Cornwall, then north along the Welsh coast. And on the 7th of August 1485, they landed at Mill Bay, near Dale, in Pembrokeshire, Wales. Jasper's Wales. The land where he had been Earl of Pembroke, where he had built his power base before being forced into exile. The land of his father, Owen Tudor, the Welsh squire who had married a queen. As Jasper stepped onto the shore, setting foot in Wales for the first time in 14 years, what must he have felt? He was 54 years old now. More than half his life had been spent in exile, in war, in the shadows of defeat. His father had been executed by the Yorkists. His brother Edmund had died in their prisons. His half-brother, King Henry VI, had been murdered. And now, at last, he was home, leading an army, with his nephew beside him. His nephew who might, if God willed it and fortune favored them, become King of England. Legend says that Henry Tudor knelt on the beach and kissed the soil, crying out, "Judge me, Lord, and fight my cause." Jasper stood beside him, placing a hand on his nephew's shoulder. They were home, and now the real battle would begin. The first task was to gather support. They marched inland, displaying Henry's banner, the Red Dragon of Wales, on a white and green field, invoking the ancient Welsh rulers from whom the Tudors claimed descent. Jasper sent messengers to all his old contacts, to the Welsh gentry who had supported him before, to those who remembered the Earl of Pembroke and were willing to fight for him again. Slowly, the army grew. Men joined them as they marched through Wales. Some came because they supported the Lancastrian cause. Some came because they hated Richard III. Some came because Jasper Tudor was one of their own, a Welshman, and they would support him against the English king. Some came for pay, for adventure, for the hope of loot if they won. By the time they crossed the Welsh border into England, Henry's force had perhaps doubled in size. 4,000 men, maybe 5,000, still smaller than what Richard III could muster, but growing. They marched through the Welsh borderlands, through Shropshire, heading toward the Midlands where Richard III was gathering his forces. Every day, more information came in from scouts and spies. Richard was at Nottingham with a large army. He was moving south to intercept them. The decisive battle would come soon, and all the while, Jasper was thinking about one crucial question: the Stanleys. Lord Thomas Stanley and his brother Sir William Stanley were two of the most powerful nobles in England. Thomas Stanley was married to Margaret Beaufort. He was Henry Tudor's stepfather. Surely he would support his stepson's cause. But Stanley was cautious, cagey, a political survivor who had managed to stay alive and prosperous through decades of war by never fully committing to one side until he was sure who would win. Richard III knew Stanley couldn't be fully trusted, so he had taken Stanley's own son hostage, threatening to execute the boy if Stanley betrayed him. Messages went back and forth between the invading army and the Stanleys. Promises were made, plans discussed, but Stanley wouldn't commit. He would bring his forces to the battlefield, but he would wait to see how the battle went before choosing a side. It was maddening, dangerous. The Stanleys commanded thousands of men. If they fought for Richard, the invasion was doomed. If they fought for Henry, victory was almost certain. And if they just watched from the sidelines while Richard and Henry fought, then anything could happen. The two armies, Richard's and Henry's, drew closer to each other. On the 21st of August 1485, they both made camp near the town of Market Bosworth in Leicestershire, only a few miles apart. Richard positioned his forces on high ground near a place called Ambion Hill. Henry's smaller force camped nearby, and the Stanley forces, they camped separately, off to one side, watching, waiting, refusing to commit. That night, by candlelight in his tent, Jasper must have gone over the plans one final time with Henry. Jasper had experience in battle. He had fought at Mortimer's Cross, at various skirmishes through the years. Henry had never commanded in a real battle, had barely even witnessed one. The Earl of Oxford, another Lancastrian exile who had joined them in France, would command the actual fighting of the battle. But Jasper would be there too, offering advice, watching over his nephew, ready to fight or die to protect the young man he had raised. They knew the odds. Richard had more men, better position, more experienced commanders. But they also had something Richard lacked. They had nothing to lose. If they lost this battle, they were dead anyway, either killed in combat or executed afterward. So they might as well fight with everything they had. And they had hope. Hope that the Stanleys would come to their aid. Hope that some of Richard's forces might desert or refuse to fight. Hope that God, or fate, or simply luck, would favour them. The 22nd of August 1485 dawned misty and cool. The two armies formed up for battle. Richard III's forces, perhaps 8,000 men, arrayed themselves on the high ground. His banners flew in the morning breeze, the white boar that was his personal symbol, the royal standards of England. Henry's forces, perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 now, formed up below the hill. Their banners showed the red dragon of Wales, the symbols of Tudor and Lancaster, the hopes of a dozen years of exile. And off to the side, the Stanleys with their thousands of men watched and waited. The battle began with an exchange of arrows, then the clash of armies meeting hand to hand. The Earl of Oxford led Henry's forces brilliantly, keeping them tightly controlled, rather than letting them spread out and be overwhelmed by Richard's superior numbers. The fighting was fierce, brutal. The ground churned to mud under thousands of trampling feet. For a time, it seemed the battle could go either way. Richard's forces pressed hard, trying to use their numbers to crush the invaders. Oxford's men held firm, fighting with the desperation of men who knew defeat meant death. And still the Stanleys did not move. Still they watched from their position between the two armies. Then Richard III made a decision that would seal his fate. His scouts reported that Henry Tudor himself was some distance from the main fighting, protected only by a small bodyguard. And Richard decided to take a desperate gamble. He would lead his household knights in a direct charge at Henry. If he could kill Henry Tudor personally, the rebellion would collapse instantly. The battle would be won. It was bold. It was reckless. It was the act of a brave man, or a desperate one. Richard III, wearing his golden crown fixed to his helmet so everyone would know who he was, led several hundred mounted knights in a charge directly toward where Henry stood. Jasper, who was near Henry at that moment, must have seen them coming, the wall of armoured horses thundering across the field, Richard's crown glittering in the sunlight, death racing toward them. This was the moment. The crucial moment. Everything they had fought for, all the years of exile, all the planning and preparation, it all came down to the next few minutes. Richard's charge smashed into Henry's bodyguard. Lances splintered, swords flashed, men screamed and fell. Richard himself killed Henry's standard-bearer, William Brandon, running the man through with his lance. The king was fighting like a demon, trying to cut his way through to Henry, trying to end the battle with a single killing stroke. Jasper must have been fighting too, sword in hand, protecting his nephew. Everything he had ever learned about warfare focused on these few desperate moments. And then, the Stanleys made their choice. Sir William Stanley, seeing Richard charging across the field, seeing Henry in danger, seeing the moment when the battle would be decided, he gave the order. His forces charged, not against Henry, but against Richard. Thousands of fresh troops smashed into Richard's charge from the side. The king's knights were surrounded, overwhelmed, and Richard himself, Richard III, the last Yorkist king, the man who had seized the throne from his nephews. Richard kept fighting. According to the chronicles, someone shouted to Richard to flee, to save himself, to regroup and fight another day. And Richard shouted back, "I will die King of England." And he did. Surrounded by enemies, fighting to the last, Richard III fell. Some say he was pulled from his horse and hacked down by multiple attackers. Others say he died fighting on foot, his crown falling from his helmet as he went down. Either way, Richard III was dead, the last Plantagenet king, the last king to die in battle in England, dead on Bosworth Field, his crown rolling in the blood-soaked mud. And when Lord Stanley picked up that crown, when he carried it across the field to where Henry Tudor stood, when he placed it on Henry's head right there on the battlefield, the Wars of the Roses were over. Henry Tudor was King Henry VII, and Jasper Tudor had made a king. Imagine that moment for Jasper, 54 years old. His entire life had led to this. Every loss, every exile, every defeat, all of it had led to this field, this day, this moment when his nephew became king. He had promised his dying brother Edmund that he would protect the child. He had raised Henry through 14 years of exile. He had taught him everything he knew. He had never given up, never stopped fighting, never stopped believing that somehow, some way, they would return. And now, it was done. They had won. The Yorkist forces were scattering, fleeing the field. Henry's soldiers were cheering, crying, embracing each other in disbelief and joy. After 30 years of civil war, after so much blood and death and destruction, finally, it was over. Jasper Tudor, standing on Bosworth Field in the August afternoon, must have felt a grief as much as triumph. His father should have been there to see this, his brother Edmund, his half-brother King Henry VI, all the Lancastrians who had fought and died for this cause. They should have been there to witness the victory they had bled for, but they were gone. Only Jasper remained, the last of that generation, the boy born in scandal in 1431, now the elder statesman of a new dynasty. Henry VII led his victorious army to London, and everywhere he went, Jasper was at his side. The uncle, the guardian, the man who had made it all possible. In October of 1485, Henry VII was crowned king in a magnificent ceremony at Westminster Abbey, and walking in the coronation procession, carrying the crown before the new king, was Jasper Tudor. It was the highest honour Henry could give his uncle. Jasper had carried the burden of the Lancastrian cause for decades. Now he would literally carry the crown to place on his nephew's head. The ceremony was everything coronations should be. Solemn, glorious, a new beginning for a nation tired of war. When the crown was placed on Henry VII's head, when the Archbishop anointed him with holy oil, when the nobles of England knelt before their new king, Jasper knelt too, and perhaps, kneeling there, he allowed himself to believe that the shadow years were finally over. The first months after Bosworth were a whirlwind of activity. Remaking a kingdom, establishing a new dynasty, rewarding those who had fought for the Tudor cause, and punishing those who had opposed it. And through all of it, Jasper was at the heart of affairs, advising his nephew on matters great and small. On the 20th of October 1485, just days before the coronation, Henry VII rewarded his uncle with the greatest honour he could bestow. Jasper Tudor was created Duke of Bedford. It was an extraordinary title, heavy with meaning. The last Duke of Bedford had been John of Lancaster, the younger brother of King Henry V, the man who had tried to hold France for England after Henry V's death. By giving Jasper this title, Henry VII was placing his uncle in the very highest rank of nobility, equating him with the greatest princes of the blood. The ceremony took place at Westminster Palace. Jasper was led to the throne by the Duke of Suffolk, who was brother-in-law to both Edward IV and Richard III, a former Yorkist, now bending the knee to the new regime. There was a certain irony in that. The old enemies coming together, kneeling before this new king, who had been nobody just months before. When Jasper rose from his knee, he was no longer just Earl of Pembroke. He was Jasper Tudor, Duke of Bedford, Knight of the Garter, uncle and counsellor to the king. From that day forward, he would be announced by heralds as the High and Mighty Prince Jasper, brother and uncle of kings, Duke of Bedford and Earl of Pembroke, brother and uncle of kings. It was true, wasn't it? Brother to Henry VI, who had died in the Tower 14 years ago. Uncle to Henry VII, who now sat on England's throne. Jasper's entire life had been lived in the shadow of royalty, in the service of kings. And now, in his middle age, he stood in the light at last. But titles and honours were only part of the reward. Henry VII also restored all of Jasper's confiscated lands and gave him new ones. Pembroke Castle, which had been Jasper's seat before his exile, was returned to him. The lordship of Glamorgan in Wales was granted to him. He was given estates throughout England and Wales, generating enough income to support the lavish lifestyle expected of a duke. And then, in November of 1485, just weeks after the coronation, came another honour. Jasper was given a wife. He was 54 years old and had never married. This was extremely unusual for a nobleman of his rank. Most nobles married in their teens or 20s to secure alliances and produce heirs. But Jasper's life had been too tumultuous, too filled with war and exile for marriage. Or perhaps he had simply never wanted to. Perhaps his loyalty to the Lancastrian cause, his devotion to raising his nephew, had been enough for him. But now Henry VII arranged a marriage for his uncle, and Jasper could hardly refuse. The bride was Kavrin Woodville, a woman of about 27 years old, widow of Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham. Kavrin was the sister of Elizabeth Woodville, who had been queen to Edward IV. This made her also the aunt of Elizabeth of York, whom Henry VII had promised to marry to unite the houses of Lancaster and York. So, the marriage of Jasper and Kavrin was part of the broader strategy of reconciliation, binding the old Yorkist families to the new Tudor regime through marriage alliances. Kavrin had been married before to the Duke of Buckingham, a difficult man who had resented the match because he thought Katherine's family was beneath his royal blood. The marriage had been unhappy, though they had managed to produce several children before Buckingham was executed for treason in 1483. Now Kavrin was being married to Jasper Tudor, a man nearly twice her age, a grizzled warrior who had spent most of his adult life in exile and war. What did she think of the match? What did Jasper think of it? We don't know. Medieval marriages among the nobility were about politics and property, not love. Companionship might grow over time, or it might not. What mattered was that the marriage served the king's purposes. The marriage was celebrated on the 7th of November 1485. Kavrin became Duchess of Bedford. She brought with her wealth from her first husband's estates, though these were kept under separate administration by agreement. She and Jasper would live together as husband and wife, attending court functions together, representing the king's interests together. At the Christmas celebrations of 1485, held at court with all the splendor of a new reign, Jasper and Kavrin were present. King Henry gave Kavrin a gift of a golden goblet, a small gesture of welcome to the family. Henry himself would marry Elizabeth of York in January of 1486, fulfilling the promise he had made before the invasion. For Jasper, these months must have been surreal. He was living in England again, for the first time in 14 years. He was wealthy, titled, honoured, married. He was at the very heart of power, one of the king's closest advisors. After so many years of being hunted, of hiding, of living on the edge of survival, now he walked openly through the palace corridors. Now nobles bowed to him. Now he sat in the king's council chamber, helping to govern the realm. But power brought responsibilities, and those responsibilities came swiftly. Henry VII had won the throne on the battlefield, but he knew his hold on it was precarious. There were still Yorkist sympathizers throughout the realm. There were nobles who had supported Richard III and now resented the Tudor regime. There were plots and conspiracies brewing in the shadows, men who wanted to overthrow the new king and restore the old order. In 1486, just months after Jasper's marriage, rebellion broke out. Francis Lovell, who had been one of Richard III's closest friends and advisors, raised a revolt in the north of England. At the same time, Humphrey Stafford raised another rebellion in the Midlands. Henry VII needed someone he could trust absolutely to put down these rebellions, someone with military experience, someone loyal beyond question, someone who commanded respect. He turned to his uncle. Jasper was given command of a royal army and sent north. He was now 65 years old by medieval standards, an age when most men were thinking of rest and retirement. But Jasper strapped on his armor one more time and rode to war. The campaign was not difficult. Lovell's rebellion had little support, and when Jasper's army arrived with thousands of men, backed by royal authority and carrying pardons for any rebels who would submit, the uprising collapsed. Lovell himself fled, eventually escaping to Flanders. Some of his supporters were captured and executed, but most were pardoned. Jasper had learned from his years in exile that mercy could be more powerful than punishment, that turning enemies into allies was better than making martyrs. The Stafford Rebellion was also quickly suppressed. By the summer of 1486, both uprisings had been crushed with minimal bloodshed. Jasper had proven that the new Tudor regime could defend itself, that rebellion would not be tolerated, but also that the king was willing to offer mercy to those who submitted. For his success, Jasper was rewarded with more titles and positions. He was made Lieutenant of Calais, the last English possession in France, a crucial military stronghold. He was also named Lord Deputy of Ireland, though this was more of an honorary title, with the real governance of Ireland left to local lords like the Earl of Kildare. Jasper also continued to hold his Welsh lands and titles. In 1486, Henry VII granted him the lordship of Glamorgan, which Jasper would hold until his death. He became, effectively, the king's viceroy in Wales, responsible for keeping peace and administering justice in the Welsh territories. But perhaps the most important role Jasper played was simply being present, being the elder statesman, the wise counsellor, the man who had seen everything and survived everything. When Henry VII faced difficult decisions, he consulted with his uncle. When nobles came to court seeking favours or positions, they often approached Jasper first, knowing that his word with the king carried weight. In 1487, another and more serious rebellion threatened the Tudor throne. This time, the rebels presented a pretender. A young boy they claimed was Edward, Earl of Warwick, the nephew of Edward IV and Richard III. In reality, the real Edward was safely locked in the Tower of London. The pretender was probably a boy named Lambert Simnel, son of a tradesman who had been coached to play the part of a prince. But it didn't matter whether the pretender was real or fake. What mattered was that powerful nobles supported him and that they had raised an army. The Earl of Lincoln, who was Richard III's designated heir, led the rebellion. He brought troops from Ireland and hired German mercenaries, creating a formidable force. Once again, Henry VII called on his uncle. Once again, Jasper prepared for battle. The two armies met at Stoke Field in Nottinghamshire on the 16th of June, 1487. It would be the last battle of the Wars of the Roses, though no one knew that at the time. The fighting was fierce. The rebels fought with desperation, knowing they faced execution if captured. The German mercenaries were professional soldiers, well-trained and well-armed. But Henry VII's forces, commanded by the Earl of Oxford with Jasper advising, were larger and better positioned. After 3 hours of brutal combat, the rebel army broke. The Earl of Lincoln was killed in the fighting. Lambert Simnel, the pretender, was captured alive. Many of the rebel nobles and foreign mercenaries were slaughtered as they tried to flee. It was a decisive victory, crushing this latest attempt to overthrow the Tudor dynasty. And Jasper, at 56 years old, had fought in yet another battle, had once again helped secure his nephew's throne. Henry VII showed mercy to young Lambert Simnel. He was only a pawn, a boy who had been used by ambitious men. Instead of executing him, Henry gave him a job in the royal kitchens. It was a clever gesture, showing that even those who had been part of conspiracies against him could find redemption in service. After Stoke Field, the realm was finally at peace. the Wars of the Roses, which had raged on and off for 30 years, consuming 2 generations of English nobility, shedding rivers of blood. Finally, they were over. The last battle had been fought, the last rebellion had been crushed, and Jasper Tudor, who had fought in the first battles and the last battles, who had endured decades of war and exile, who had never given up even when the cause seemed hopeless, he could finally rest. Well, not quite rest. There were still duties to perform, councils to attend, ceremonies to participate in. Jasper spent the next few years traveling between his various estates, attending court when summoned, consulting with the king on matters of state. In 1488, he took possession of Cardiff Castle, a symbol of his power in Wales. The castle, which had been held by various nobles throughout the Wars of the Roses, was now his. He made improvements to it, strengthening its defences, making it more comfortable as a residence. His marriage to Catherine Woodville seems to have been companionable, if not passionate. They lived together, they attended court together, they presented a united front to the world. Catherine was a capable woman, experienced in managing noble households after her first marriage. She helped administer Jasper's estates, hosted guests at their various residences, attended to the social duties expected of a duchess. But there were no children. Whether they were unable to have children or simply chose not to, we don't know. Some sources mention a possible stillborn son around 1490, but this is uncertain. What is certain is that Jasper had no legitimate heirs. The dukedom of Bedford would die with him. There were rumours, as there always are, of illegitimate children. Some sources claim Jasper had a daughter named Helen, born years before his marriage, who had married a merchant in London. But these claims are uncertain, appearing only in records written long after Jasper's death. In his lifetime, he acknowledged no bastards, mentioned no illegitimate children in his will. Perhaps he had lived too long in the shadows, too focused on raising his nephew and serving the Lancastrian cause, to have time for love affairs and secret families. Or perhaps he had simply been discreet, keeping such matters private as any nobleman would. As the 1490s progressed, Jasper settled into the role of elder statesman. He was the last of his generation, the last person alive who remembered the early days of Henry VI's reign, who had known Katherine of Valois and Owen Tudor, who had fought in the first battles of the Wars of the Roses. Everyone else from that time was gone, dead in battle, executed by enemies, faded away through age and illness. King Henry VII relied increasingly on younger advisors, men like Reginald Bray and Richard Fox, who had supported him during the exile but were a generation younger than Jasper. These were men of the new age, skilled in finance and administration, building the strong centralized government that would characterize the Tudor monarchy. But Jasper was still honored, still consulted, still present at important ceremonies. In 1489, at the Tower of London, he witnessed the creation of Henry VII's eldest son, Arthur, as Prince of Wales. Little Arthur, just 3 years old, was the heir to the throne, the next generation of Tudors, the future of the dynasty that Jasper had helped create. Did Jasper think about his own nephew Henry as he watched little Arthur? Did he remember that cold January day in 1457, when Henry Tudor was born at Pembroke Castle, when Jasper had first looked down at his orphaned nephew and promised to protect him? So much had happened since then. 32 years of war and exile and struggle, and now that same nephew was king, and his son would be king after him, and the Tudor dynasty seemed secure. In 1492, at the age of 61, Jasper participated in one last military campaign. Henry VII, seeking to assert English power in Europe, mounted an invasion of France. It was more of a demonstration than a serious conquest attempt. The king wanted to remind the French that England was not to be ignored. Jasper accompanied the army to France, though at his age he was more of an honorary commander than an active military leader. The campaign was brief and bloodless. The French king, eager to avoid a prolonged war, negotiated a favorable treaty and paid a large sum of money to persuade the English to go home. Henry VII accepted the deal, considering it a victory. He had gotten gold from France and demonstrated English strength without losing a single soldier in battle. It was Jasper's last time on campaign, his last time donning armor and riding with an army. After France, he returned to England and his estates, content to live out his remaining years in peace. The consequences of Jasper's long life were evident everywhere he looked. The realm was at peace. The Tudor dynasty was established. His nephew was a successful king, bringing stability and prosperity to a nation that had known little of either for decades. The nobility, both Yorkist and Lancastrian, had been brought into the new regime, their old rivalries set aside in service to the crown. All of this was partly because of Jasper, because he had never given up, because he had protected young Henry through 14 years of exile, because he had fought at Bosworth when others might have despaired, because he had served loyally, selflessly, without seeking the throne for himself even when he might have had better claim than his nephew. Jasper had lived in the shadows of kings his entire life, in the shadow of his half-brother Henry VI, in the shadow of his nephew Henry VII. But without Jasper's shadow presence, without his steady hand guiding events from behind the scenes, none of it would have happened. The consequences of a life lived in service, of loyalty that never wavered, of a shadow presence that shaped the light. These were Jasper Tudor's legacy, and as he grew older, as his hair turned white and his body began to fail him, he could look back on those consequences with satisfaction. He had kept his promise to his dead brother Edmund. He had raised Edmund's son to be king. He had seen the Lancastrian cause, for which he had fought for 30 years, finally triumph. He had helped establish a new dynasty that would rule England for over a century. Not bad for a boy born in scandal, raised in a convent, who had spent most of his life as a fugitive in foreign lands. The years after 1492 were quiet ones for Jasper Tudor. He was in his 60s now, a great age for the 15th century. Most men who survived to such an age were content to sit by the fire, to reminisce about the old days, to let younger men take on the burdens of government and war. Jasper did slow down, certainly. He spent more time at his estates, less time travelling the realm on the king's business. Cardiff Castle and his other Welsh properties became his primary residences. He managed his lands, dispensed justice in his courts, lived the life of a great nobleman who had earned his peace. But he was still part of the government, still consulted on important matters. When the King's Council met, Jasper was often there, his opinions valued because of his decades of experience. When foreign ambassadors came to England, Jasper sometimes attended the formal dinners and receptions representing the dignity of the Tudor court. And always, he was the King's uncle. That relationship defined him more than any title or office. Henry VII trusted Jasper implicitly, loved him as the man who had raised him, relied on him as a counselor who would always speak truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable. We can imagine the quiet evenings, Jasper and Henry sitting together in a private chamber, talking over old times, remembering the years in Brittany, the storms that nearly drowned them when they fled Wales, the terror of learning that Landais was about to hand them over to Richard III, remembering the landing at Mill Bay, the march through Wales, the desperate night before Bosworth. Henry VII was building a New England, a nation of strong central government, efficient tax collection, careful diplomacy. He was not a warrior king, like his grandfather, Henry V. He was not a gentle, pious king like his great-uncle Henry VI. He was something new, a king who governed through administration rather than charisma, who preferred negotiation to battle, who counted pennies carefully because he understood that royal power rested on a full treasury. And Jasper represented the old ways, the age of chivalry and warfare, of personal loyalty between lord and vassal, of settling disputes with a sword rather than a lawsuit. But he adapted. He supported his nephew's new methods, even when they were foreign to his own instincts, because that was what Jasper did. He served, he adapted. He did what was needed for the cause, for the family, for the king. In 1494, when Jasper was 63 years old, something happened that reminded everyone that the Tudor dynasty, for all its seeming stability, still faced challenges. A new pretender emerged, another young man, claiming to be one of the princes who had disappeared in the tower, claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, Edward IV's younger son. This pretender's name was Perkin Warbeck, and unlike Lambert Simnel, he was a more convincing fraud. He was supported by foreign powers, the King of France, the Duchess of Burgundy, sister of Edward IV, and Richard III, the King of Scotland. He raised armies, launched invasions, caused Henry VII real concern. Jasper was consulted about the threat. How seriously should the king take this pretender? Was Warbeck really Richard of York, miraculously escaped from the tower? Jasper didn't think so. He had been in England when the princes disappeared. He knew how unlikely it was that one of them had survived, but whether Warbeck was real or fake didn't matter. What mattered was that powerful people were supporting him, using him as a tool against the Tudor regime. The Warbeck threat would last for years, finally ending only in 1499 when the pretender was captured and executed. But by then, Jasper would be gone. In the spring or early summer of 1495, Jasper's health began to fail. He was 64 years old now. He had lived a hard life. Decades of warfare, years of exile, living on inadequate food and uncertain shelter, the constant stress of being hunted by enemies, all of it had taken a toll on his body. The exact nature of his illness is not recorded. Medieval sources rarely gave details about diseases. They spoke of fevers, of wasting sicknesses, of old age. Perhaps it was a disease of the heart or lungs. Perhaps it was simply the accumulated wear of 6 decades of hard living. Whatever it was, Jasper knew he was dying. He retired to Thornbury Manor in Gloucestershire, one of his estates, a comfortable place where he could be cared for in his final days. Kavrin, his wife, was with him. So were various servants and attendants, men and women who had served him for years. And messengers were sent to London to inform King Henry VII that his uncle was failing. Henry came. Of course he came. Whatever affairs of state pressed on him, however busy he was with governing the realm, he would not let his uncle die alone. He rode to Thornbury Manor, bringing with him his mother, Margaret Beaufort, Jasper's sister-in-law, Edmund's widow, the woman Jasper had protected all those years ago when she was a young widow with an infant son. Perhaps Queen Elizabeth of York came as well, though the records are unclear. But certainly Henry and Margaret were there, keeping vigil as Jasper's life slowly ebbed away. What did they talk about in those final days? Did they reminisce about the old times, the struggles they had endured together? Did Jasper give his nephew final advice about ruling? Final wisdom from a life spent in service to the crown? Or perhaps they spoke of simpler things, of family, of memories, of love and loss. Jasper had lost so many people in his life. His mother when he was 5, his brother Edmund when Jasper was 25, his father executed on a headsman's block, his half-brother King Henry VI murdered in the Tower. He had spent his entire life surrounded by death, living in the shadow of mortality. And now it was his turn, after 64 years, after surviving wars and exile and battles and assassination attempts. Now, peacefully in his bed at Thornbury Manor, Jasper Tudor was dying. In December of 1495, Jasper made his will. It was a practical document disposing of his estates and property according to the customs of the time. The vast majority of his lands would go to his nephew the king, since Jasper had no legitimate children to inherit. Some property that had been entailed would go to Henry's eldest son, Arthur, the little boy who would one day be Prince of Wales. There were bequests for prayers for his soul, as was customary. Money was left to various religious houses to say masses for Jasper's spirit after his death. He remembered his parents in his will, prayers for the souls of Owen Tudor and Katherine of Valois, and prayers for Edmund Tudor, his brother, dead for 40 years, but not forgotten. Interestingly, Katherine, his wife, was not prominently mentioned in the will. This was not unusual. Her jointure and property rights had been settled at the time of their marriage, so there was no need to address them in the will. But it suggests, perhaps, that theirs had been a marriage of convenience more than deep affection. They had lived together for 10 years, presented a united front to the world. But the great love of Jasper's life had never been any woman. It had been his family, his cause, his duty. On the 21st of December, 1495, as the year drew toward its close and the winter solstice approached, Jasper Tudor, Duke of Bedford, died. The accounts say he passed peacefully, with his wife Katherine at his bedside, with the king, his nephew, present or nearby, with the prayers of the church surrounding him. He was 64 years old. He had lived longer than his father, longer than his brother, longer than most men of his generation. He had survived what should have killed him a dozen times over: battles, exile, pursuit by enemies, storms at sea, the intrigues of powerful men who wanted him dead. And in the end, he died in his bed, surrounded by people who loved him, having accomplished everything he had set out to do. How many men can say that at the end? How many have such a satisfying close to their story? The news of Jasper's death spread quickly through the realm. At court, there was genuine grief. Nobles who had fought beside him, who had known him for decades, mourned the loss. Common people in Wales, who remembered him as a just lord who had protected them, lit candles for his soul. Henry VII mourned deeply. He had lost his uncle, his mentor, the man who had been more of a father to him than his biological father Edmund could ever be. He had lost his most trusted advisor, the one person who had been with him through absolutely everything, who had never wavered in loyalty, who had made it all possible. Margaret Beaufort mourned too. Jasper had been her protector when she was a frightened 13-year-old widow with a newborn son. He had kept her safe, had raised her son when she could not, had never asked for anything in return except the chance to serve. Jasper had specified in his will that he wished to be buried at Keynsham Abbey in Somerset. This was a somewhat surprising choice. Not a royal abbey like Westminster, not even a cathedral in Wales where he had held so much power. Keynsham was a relatively obscure Augustinian abbey that Jasper had only acquired the year before, in 1494, as a bequest from Lady Agnes Shane. Why did he choose Keynsham? We don't know for certain. Perhaps he wanted to be buried somewhere quiet, away from the pomp and ceremony of royal burial grounds. Perhaps he had some connection to the place that we no longer understand. Or perhaps he simply wanted to rest somewhere that was his own, a property he had chosen rather than inherited, a place that represented the peaceful final chapter of his life rather than the turbulent earlier decades. His funeral was attended by the king and the great nobles of the realm. The ceremony was solemn, befitting a duke and a man who had served two kings faithfully. Jasper's body was laid to rest in the Abbey church, though the exact location of his tomb is now lost. The abbey was dissolved during the English Reformation in the 1530s, its buildings torn down, its stones carried away for other construction. Somewhere beneath the ruins, Jasper Tudor lies still, his final resting place unmarked and forgotten. After Jasper's death, his property passed to the crown, as specified in his will. His widow Kavrin had her widow's portion and jointure, providing her with income for life. She would survive Jasper by only 2 years, dying in 1497 at the age of 39. Still relatively young, but her life had been hard in its own ways. Married first to a difficult man who resented her, then to an elderly warrior who was more focused on politics than romance. After Katherine's death, she married one final time to a much younger man named Richard Wingfield, but that marriage too was brief. She died soon after. She was buried at Tewkesbury Abbey, not beside Jasper, suggesting that their marriage, while respectable and proper, had not been the great love story of either of their lives. The Dukedom of Bedford died with Jasper. Henry VII did not recreate it for anyone else. In a sense, it was retired in honor of the man who had borne it, the man who had made the Tudor dynasty possible. Jasper's other titles, Earl of Pembroke, the various lordships in Wales, these were eventually granted to others, but for a time, they too remained vacant, as if in acknowledgement that the man who had held them could not easily be replaced. In the months after Jasper's death, as Henry VII continued to govern the realm, he must have felt the loss keenly. The king was only 38 years old, still vigorous, still facing challenges, but now he faced them without his uncle's counsel, without the reassuring presence of the man who had always been there. who had always known what to do. Margaret Beaufort, Henry's mother, stepped into some of that advisory role. She was a formidable woman, intelligent and pious, deeply involved in her son's government. But she could not replace Jasper. She had not lived through the years of exile, had not fought at Bosworth, had not shared all those experiences that bound uncle and nephew together. The shadow had fallen on Jasper Tudor's life. That final shadow from which none of us escape, the shadow of death. But even in death, his influence lingered. His legacy shaped the realm he had helped create. And perhaps, in whatever afterlife Jasper believed in, he was reunited with those he had lost. With his mother Katherine, who had died when he was only 5. With his brother Edmund, who had never met his own son. With his father Owen, beheaded by the Yorkists. With his half-brother King Henry VI, murdered in the Tower. All of them together again. The Tudors, who had fought and bled and died to create a dynasty. The boy born in scandal in 1431. The queen who had loved a Welsh squire. The brother who had died too young. The king who had been too gentle for his brutal age. All of them shadows now, but shadows that had shaped the light. Shadows that had changed England's history. Jasper's life had been lived in the shadows of others. In the shadow of his mother's scandal, his half-brother's crown, his nephew's claim to greatness. But without those shadows, without Jasper's presence in the dim corners of history, the bright figures at the center of events would never have shone so clearly. Sometimes it is the shadows that make the light possible. Sometimes the forgotten people are the ones who make history happen. Sometimes the man who never seeks glory for himself is the one who makes it possible for others to achieve it. Jasper Tudor was such a man. And on that December day in 1495, when the candles were lit around his deathbed, when the prayers were said and the breath left his body for the final time, the shadows welcomed one of their own home. Let us pause here in the quiet candlelight and consider what Jasper Tudor left behind, not in lands or titles, which passed to others, not in children, for he had none to carry his name, but in the shape of history itself, in the dynasty he helped create, in the kingdom he helped save. History, when it remembers Jasper Tudor at all, often relegates him to a footnote. He is the uncle of Henry VII. He is a Lancastrian commander. He is mentioned briefly in passing, a supporting character in someone else's story. But look closer. Look into the shadows, and you see a different picture entirely. Without Jasper Tudor, there is no Tudor dynasty. This is not hyperbole, it is simple fact. If Jasper had not protected his infant nephew after Edmund Tudor's death, if he had not fled into exile with 14-year-old Henry rather than abandoning him to save himself, if he had not spent 14 years in Brittany teaching and preparing Henry for a crown that seemed impossibly distant, if he had not organized the invasion of 1485, if he had not fought at Bosworth, if he had not helped crush the rebellions that followed, at any of these points, the thread could have broken. Henry Tudor could have died young, could have been captured by Yorkist forces, could have lived out his life as an obscure exile in Brittany, could have lost at Bosworth, could have been overthrown in the first years of his reign. But none of that happened, because Jasper was there, always there, in the shadows perhaps, but there nonetheless. Think about what this means for English history. If there is no Tudor dynasty, then there is no King Henry VIII, the larger-than-life monarch who broke with Rome and transformed England from a Catholic nation to a Protestant one. There is no Edward VI, the boy king under whom Protestantism was established. There is no Bloody Mary, whose attempt to restore Catholicism failed. There is no Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen who defeated the Spanish Armada and ushered in a golden age of English literature and exploration. The entire 16th century of English history. Shakespeare, the English Reformation, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the beginnings of English colonization in the New World. All of it flows from the Tudor dynasty, and the Tudor dynasty flows from Jasper Tudor's decision, made again and again over 30 years, to never give up on the Lancastrian cause and to protect his nephew at all costs. Of course, Jasper was not acting alone. Margaret Beaufort, Henry's mother, played a crucial role in the conspiracies that led to the invasion of 1485. The Earl of Oxford was a brilliant military commander at Bosworth. The Stanley brothers' decision to support Henry turned the tide of battle. Many people contributed to the Tudor victory, but Jasper was the constant factor. Jasper was there from the very beginning, when baby Henry was born at Pembroke Castle. Jasper was there through all the long years of exile. Jasper was there at the landing in Wales and at Bosworth Field. Jasper was there in the first difficult years of Henry VII's reign, helping to establish and defend the new dynasty. Others came and went, but Jasper endured, and his loyalty was not just to the Lancastrian cause in abstract. It was personal. It was loyalty to his half-brother Henry VI, loyalty to his dead brother Edmund, loyalty to his nephew Henry. It was the loyalty of family, the loyalty of love, the loyalty that says, I will stand with you even when it seems hopeless, even when everyone else has given up, even when the sensible thing would be to make peace with the winning side. That kind of loyalty is rare in any age. In the 15th century, when nobles routinely switched sides based on who seemed likely to win, when self-preservation often trumped honor, when betrayal was commonplace, Jasper's unwavering loyalty was extraordinary. Consider Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, switched sides multiple times during the Wars of the Roses. George, Duke of Clarence, betrayed his brother Edward IV twice. Even loyal nobles like the Duke of Norfolk sometimes had to make pragmatic decisions about which side to support. But Jasper never wavered. From the moment he swore loyalty to his half-brother King Henry VI in the 1450s until the day he died in 1495, he never betrayed the Lancastrian cause. 40 years of absolute loyalty, through defeat after defeat, through years of hopeless exile, through times when supporting the Lancastrians meant almost certain death if captured. Why? What made Jasper Tudor so loyal when others were not? Part of it was surely personal. Henry VI had been kind to him, had raised him from obscurity, had given him titles and power when he could have left him forgotten in a convent. Jasper owed him everything. Part of it was honor. Jasper had made an oath, and he kept it. In an age that valued chivalry and knightly virtue, Jasper embodied those ideals more truly than many of the famous knights and nobles, whose deeds were celebrated in tournaments and songs. And part of it was simply love. Love for his family, love for his brother's child, love for the cause that gave meaning to his life. Jasper was not a man who sought power for its own sake. All the evidence suggests he would have been content to serve others, to work in the shadows, as long as the cause he believed in triumphed. This quality of selfless service, of loyalty that did not seek reward, of work done in the shadows without expectation of glory. This is perhaps Jasper's greatest legacy, not the titles he held, not the battles he fought, but the example he set of what it means to serve faithfully. Let us consider also the specific ways Jasper shaped the man who became Henry VII. Henry Tudor spent his most formative years under Jasper's care. From age 4 to age 18, during the years when a boy becomes a man, Henry was raised primarily by his uncle. Yes, he had guardians like William Herbert for a few years, and he learned much during the exile in Brittany from the Duke of Brittany's courtiers. But the constant presence, the primary influence, was Jasper. What did Jasper teach his nephew? We can infer from what we know of Henry VII's character. Henry was cautious, calculating, unwilling to take unnecessary risks. This was Jasper's lesson, learned from all those years of exile, from watching one reckless gamble after another by the Lancastrians end in defeat. Jasper taught Henry to wait, to prepare, to strike only when the moment was right. Henry was financially shrewd, accumulating a large royal treasury through careful management. This too may have come from Jasper, who had known poverty in exile, who understood that power required gold as much as swords, who had seen the Lancastrian cause fail, partly because they could not match the Yorkists' wealth. Henry was willing to make alliances with former enemies, to forgive those who had opposed him if they would serve him now. This was mercy as policy, not sentiment, and it was something Jasper practiced as well. When Jasper put down the rebellions of 1486 to 87, he offered pardons rather than executions. He knew from experience that making martyrs only created more enemies. Henry was not a warrior king, did not seek glory in battle, preferred to avoid war when possible. Some historians have criticized this, seeing it as timidity, but Jasper, who had fought in many battles and won few of them, who had seen the best warriors of England cut down in their prime, may have taught his nephew that survival and statecraft were worth more than martial glory. In all these ways and more, Jasper shaped Henry VII, and through Henry, Jasper shaped the Tudor monarchy, the style of rule, the priorities, the very character of the dynasty. Henry VII's reign laid the foundation for all that followed. He restored royal finances after the waste of the Wars of the Roses. He established strong central government, reducing the power of overmighty nobles who had torn the realm apart for 3 decades. He made England a player in European diplomacy, arranging marriages and alliances that would shape English foreign policy for generations. All of this was possible because Henry VII had a secure throne. And he had a secure throne partly because his uncle had helped him win it and then helped him keep it. Let us also remember what Jasper meant to Wales. Jasper was Welsh through his father, Owen Tudor, descended from ancient Welsh princes. He was Earl of Pembroke, one of the great Welsh lordships. He held extensive lands in Wales, administered Welsh castles, was effectively the king's viceroy in Welsh territories, and he was proud of his Welsh heritage. The red dragon banner that Henry Tudor carried at Bosworth was Jasper's idea, invoking the ancient Welsh tradition. The decision to land the invasion force in Wales, rather than somewhere in England, was at least partly Jasper's counsel, knowing that he could raise support among the Welsh gentry who remembered him. For the Welsh, the Tudor victory had special significance. For the first time since before the Norman conquest, a dynasty with Welsh blood ruled England. Owen Tudor, the Welsh squire, had married a queen and fathered a line of kings. The ancient prophecies that someday the Welsh would again rule Britain seemed to have come true. This may seem fanciful to modern ears, but to 15th century Welsh people, it mattered deeply. Wales had been conquered by England, had been treated as inferior, had seen its language and customs suppressed. But now a man of Welsh descent sat on England's throne. The Dragon of Wales flew beside the Lions of England, and that was partly Jasper's doing. He kept the Welsh connection alive. He maintained ties with Welsh gentry. He represented Welsh interests at court. The Tudor dynasty never forgot its Welsh roots, and that was largely because Jasper, the last living link to Owen Tudor, made sure they remembered. Consider also what might have been had Jasper's life gone differently. If Jasper had been willing to make peace with the Yorkists at any point, if he had accepted Edward IV's offers of pardon and reconciliation, he could have lived a comfortable life. Many Lancastrians did exactly that. They submitted to Edward IV, were forgiven, had their lands restored, served the Yorkist regime. Jasper was offered such opportunities. Edward IV wanted to bring the realm together, wanted to reconcile former enemies. Jasper could have returned to England in the 1470s, could have been Earl of Pembroke under Edward IV, could have lived peacefully and prosperously, but he refused. He stayed in exile. He kept faith with the lost cause. Why? Because he had sworn an oath to Henry VI, because he had promised his dead brother Edmund to protect little Henry Tudor, because he believed in the Lancastrian right to the throne, even when that right seemed to matter to no one else. This was not pragmatism. This was not political calculation. This was honor, pure and simple. The kind of honor that seems almost quaint today. The kind of loyalty that seems irrational to our cynical modern minds. But it was this irrational loyalty, this impractical honor, that made the Tudor dynasty possible. And what of Jasper's personal life? What of the man behind the titles and the battles? We know so little about Jasper as a person. Medieval sources tell us what he did, but rarely how he felt about it. We don't know if he was happy or sad, cheerful or melancholy, whether he loved music or poetry, whether he had close friendships or lived a solitary life. We know he never married until he was 54, and then only when his nephew the king arranged it. This suggests a man who had sacrificed personal happiness for duty, who had put his cause before his own desires, who had perhaps become so focused on protecting Henry and serving the Lancastrian claim that he had no room in his life for love or family of his own. We know he had no legitimate children, and possibly no illegitimate ones either. In an age when noblemen routinely fathered bastards, when sexual license was common among the aristocracy, Jasper seems to have been either unusually chaste or unusually discreet. His will makes no mention of children, acknowledges no one as his offspring. This too speaks to a life of service over self. Jasper seems to have poured all his energy, all his devotion, into raising his nephew and serving his cause. There was no wife to mourn him deeply, no children to carry on his memory, only his sister-in-law, Margaret Beaufort, his nephew the king, and the nephew's children. The dynasty Jasper had helped create but which did not bear his name. Was he lonely? Did he regret the personal sacrifices he had made? We will never know, but we can speculate that in those final days at Thornbury Manor, as death approached, Jasper looked back on his life and felt satisfaction. He had kept his promises. He had never wavered in his loyalty. He had raised his brother's son to be king. He had helped establish a new dynasty that would rule England for over a century and transform the nation in profound ways. Not bad for a life's work. Even if history would largely forget his name, even if he would be relegated to the shadows while brighter figures took center stage, Jasper understood, perhaps better than anyone, that sometimes the most important work is done in the shadows, that sometimes the unsung heroes are the ones who make heroism possible, that sometimes the forgotten people are the ones who shape history's course. He was content to be forgotten as long as the cause he served was remembered. He was willing to live in shadows as long as his nephew could live in the light of a crown. This is the whisper that echoes down through the centuries. The quiet voice of Jasper Tudor, speaking from the margins of history, reminding us that loyalty matters, that honor has value, that service without seeking glory is the highest form of nobility. The whisper says, "I was born in scandal, raised in obscurity, spent most of my life in exile and defeat. I never wore a crown, never commanded a great kingdom, never had poems written about my deeds or songs sung about my valor, but I kept my promises. I protected those who needed protecting. I never betrayed those who trusted me. And in the end, I helped create something that outlasted my own life." Is that not enough? Is that not a life well lived? And the answer, whispered back from the shadows of history, is yes. Yes, it is enough. More than enough. Jasper Tudor died almost 530 years ago. As I speak these words into the candlelit quiet of this recording, his grave is lost, his bones long since returned to dust. The abbey where he was buried was torn down during the Reformation. The castle where he lived are ruins or museums. The world he knew is gone, vanished as completely as if it never existed. But his legacy remains. Every British monarch from Henry VII to the present day, they are all Jasper Tudor's legacy. The English Reformation, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the British Empire, the modern United Kingdom, all of it traces back, in some measure, to the moment when Jasper Tudor decided to protect his infant nephew instead of abandoning him to save himself. All of it flows from the decision Jasper made, again and again, year after year, to remain loyal even when loyalty seemed pointless. All of it grows from the shadows where Jasper Tudor lived and worked and fought and finally died. The whisper of his name may be faint now, but listen closely and you can still hear it. In the stones of Welsh castles, in the pages of history books, in the genealogies of kings, Jasper Tudor, the uncle who made a dynasty, the shadow who shaped the light. His story is not the grand tale of conquering kings or brilliant queens. It is the quieter story of faithful service, of patient endurance, of loyalty that never wavered. It is the story of a man who lived in the margins, but whose marginal life made all the central events possible. And perhaps, that is the most important story of all. Perhaps the world needs fewer heroes who seek glory and more servants who seek only to do what is right. Perhaps the example of Jasper Tudor, the man history forgot, but who shaped the history we remember. Perhaps that example is worth more than all the celebrated names in the chronicle. The shadows have their own nobility, the whispers have their own power, and the forgotten lives sometimes change the world. This is what Jasper Tudor left behind. Not lands or titles, which passed to others, not children, for he had none, but a legacy of loyalty, an example of service, a pattern of living that says, duty matters more than glory, honor matters more than reward, and sometimes the best way to serve is to work in the shadows so that others can stand in the light. That whisper, that legacy, it lives on. And as long as people tell the story of the Tudors, as long as anyone remembers Henry VII and Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, somewhere in the shadows of that story, if you listen carefully, you can hear the name Jasper Tudor, the uncle who made it all possible, the shadow who shaped kings, the forgotten man who changed the course of English history. And so we come to the end of Jasper Tudor's whispered story. A life that began in scandal and secrecy in 1431 and ended in honor and peace in 1495. A life lived almost entirely in the shadows of others, yet a life that shaped the destiny of a kingdom. He walked beside kings, half-brother to Henry VI, uncle to Henry VII, but never sought a crown for himself. He fought in the Wars of the Roses from the first battle to the last, but won fame not through victory, but through unwavering loyalty. He spent 14 years in exile, teaching and protecting a nephew who seemed to have no chance of ever wearing a crown, and then watched that nephew become king. His legacy is written in the dynasty he helped create, the Tudor monarchs who would rule England for over a century. His legacy is written in the lives he protected. His nephew Henry, who would never have survived a kingship without Jasper's guardianship. His legacy is written in the example he set, of service without seeking glory, of loyalty that never wavered, of a life lived in the shadows so that others could stand in the light. Jasper Tudor was born the son of a scandal, raised by nuns, made an earl by royal favor, driven into exile by political enemies, hunted by kings, sheltered in foreign lands, and finally brought home in triumph to help establish a new dynasty. His life spanned the entire Wars of the Roses, witnessing the destruction of one royal line and the birth of another. And through it all, he remained constant, loyal to his family, faithful to his cause, devoted to his duty. The boy born in shadows became the man who shaped kings. The exile became the duke. The hunted fugitive became the honored elder statesman. His bones lie somewhere beneath the ruins of Keynsham Abbey, unmarked and unremembered by most. But his story echoes still, a whisper from history's margins, telling us that sometimes the forgotten people are the ones who matter most. Thank you so much for walking through the shadows with me tonight here on Kavrin. If this story touched you in any way, I'd be incredibly grateful for a like. It truly helps others discover these forgotten historical tales. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What do you think Jasper felt in that moment at Bosworth Field, watching his nephew become king after all those years of struggle and exile? Your engagement means everything to this channel and helps us grow. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider joining our community of shadow history lovers. We have so many more forgotten stories waiting to be told, more whispered lives to explore, more hidden journeys through time. Together, we'll keep pulling back the curtains on history's shadows, giving voice to those who lived in the margins, but shaped the center. As you drift into sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of medieval castles, of exile in distant lands, of a man who never gave up hope, even when hope seemed hopeless. Perhaps you'll remember that the quietest lives sometimes echo the loudest through history. Perhaps you'll carry with you the whisper of Jasper Tudor's name, a name that deserves to be remembered, even if history has largely forgotten it. Sleep well, dear friend, and may Jasper Tudor's whispered stories stay with you in your dreams. May his example of loyalty, service, and unwavering determination inspire you in your own life, whatever shadows you may walk through, whatever light you seek to create. The candles are burning low now. The fire in the hearth is dying to embers. And in the shadows of this medieval chamber we've shared tonight, Jasper Tudor rests still. His story told one more time, his memory kept alive a little longer. Until next time, good night from Kavrin.